Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
Our story begins on a crisp September evening. Since our hotel's restaurants was closed on Mondays and Tuesdays, I was the only employee in the building past 5:30 in the afternoon. Us at the front desk had a habit of sitting in the office and stepping out when we heard a guest approach. This particular evening, my chest was very sore, so I was not in the best mood. While in the office, I hear the lobby door open, so I walk out to the desk. "Hi, how are you today?" The only description I can give for this man is that he just barely looks like one of the actors who has portrayed Spider-Man, so that is how I will be referring to them. "Hi, I just came from insert military base here. Is it okay if I use the restroom and charge my phone for a little bit?" A little background on the hotel. We were located within a state park and had 6 different buildings spread out. The main building where operations was located was a high traffic area, so random people coming in was not unusual. "Yeah, go ahead." I go back into the office. Spider-Man takes care of his business and stops back at the desk. He begins striking up a conversation with me about different things. We sold beer at the desk, and he had asked me for a recommendation, to which I told him that I was not of age. I was 19 at the time. All that I told him about myself was that I was in school for hospitality management and that I wanted to open my own hotel one day. Spider-Man then begins to go on and on about his line of work. He's a life coach, how he's written 2 books, and just about how he loves customer service. In response to him unnecessarily talking at me, not with me, for like 45 minutes, I'm giving him a lot of yeah and oh, really. As mentioned before, I had chest pain and was not in the mood to converse with guests about things not pertaining to my job or their stay. As we near the end of our conversation, Spider-Man says, "I really enjoyed our conversation and would love to keep in touch." Of course, my response is, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't give out my personal information." "No, not your personal information, your business information." At this job, I was an FDA, so I had no business information, which I let him know. Spider-Man was being very pushy, so I eventually say, "Oh, I work full-time in the evenings, so if you ever come back, you'll probably see me." Hindsight is 2020. Obviously, looking back, I would not have relayed this to him, but to everyone else who works in the front office, telling people the general time you're in is not inherently weird. Usually, when I check someone in, I tell them that I'm there until whatever amount of time if they need anything. I guess that satisfied him, so he left for the night. Fast forward a week or so, and it is busy. My property had event spaces in 3 different buildings, and I believe this night we had weddings in 2 of them. Since it was a weekend, my coworker and I were split up, so I was doing check-ins at the main building, and she was doing check-ins at the secondary building. The secondary building was on the same road as the cabins we rented out, so we would call all of the guests checking into any of those buildings and let them know to head over there for check-in instead of the main building. We were a smaller property, but since we were located in a state park, I had to deal with hotel guests, wedding guests, and park people, not even mentioning the phone. I was slammed, the phone would ring, I would take care of the guest, then someone would come to check in or buy something, so I couldn't stop to use the restroom. Amid this chaos, a walks Spider-Man in. He comes straight to the desk. "How are you?" Imagine you're me, who had told a random person who was not staying at the hotel the hours you worked the week prior, and they come back and remember your name shortly after. Obviously, you would believe he came back in to see you. I'm shocked, but do not have time for his pointless attempt at a conversation with me. I respond coldly, "Hi, is there anything I can help you with?" "Yeah, just thinking of grabbing a beer from you and heading up to the bar." "You should head up there first." "What? The bar? It's closing soon." "Go there first." Spider-Man was taken aback, but goes up anyway. He comes back down and has the gall to ask me, "Last time I was here you were so nice and talked to me, but now you're being very cold." I snap at him. "I'm not in the mood to have a conversation right now. I'm extremely busy, the phone keeps on ringing, and I can't even stop to use the restroom." "Well, I'm sorry to hear that. You can go to the bathroom if you need. I'm fine waiting." That moment, my coworker calls me and asks me to bring her something to the secondary building. I'm very irritated at this point, but at least it will get me away from Spider-Man. "No, I have to go over to the secondary building. What can I grab for you?" He begins to look over at our selection, but just says he would come back later and walks away. My coworker calls me back and tells me that she didn't need me to go over there anymore. I tell her briefly about the guy and go on to finally take a leak. My coworker calls me and is asking for help. Our cabins had 6 individually rentable guest rooms, and the lobby area had a communal fireplace. The fireplaces had a tendency to smoke out the building, partially due to guests not knowing how to use a fireplace fireplace, them not being cleaned out for the season, and the building's age. Of course, one of the guests used the fireplace, it smoked out the building, and all of the guests were upset. We were sold out and had no management on duty, so there was nothing we could do for them in the moment. She tells me that this guy keeps bugging her about a solution, but she would tell me more when she got back to the main building. When she gets back, she tells fully about everything going on with the guests while we are sitting in the office. Someone comes to the desk and she goes out to speak to them. I walk out as well, and behold, Spider-Man was standing in front of me. "Did you get that break you needed?" I said yeah, and walked back into the office. When my coworker comes back, she tells me that was the guy who had been bugging her. Turns out, he was a guest and I had no idea. I tell her everything that happened with Spider-Man, and she lets me know that he was talking to her about my quote-unquote amazing customer service and just went on and on about me. I never did anything special for him. I wouldn't even say the bare minimum. The following day, I tell my department manager about Spider-Man and say that if a complaint came through about me being rude to a guest, it is because I thought he was coming in specifically to see me. My manager told me it was alright and that the guy was weird. Spider-Man spoke to my manager earlier in the day when he checked out and was talking about something with him being on the run and having police involved. Fast forward to a setting October, we had an event in the main building, so a lot of people were meandering around. My manager, whose hours were always 9 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, came in to work the evening shift with me for whatever reason. By working, he sat down in the office the whole time doing whatever knows what. There were some guests that needed a ride to the train station and were unable to find one, so my manager, who was a rideshare driver on the side, took 2 separate groups of people over, so he was gone for 2 hours sporadically. Since my manager was there on and off, I couldn't sit in the back and had to stay out front the whole time. I would like to say around 8:30 at night, I was standing at the desk when in walked Spider-Man. Of course, I recognized him immediately, but decided to pretend I had no idea who he was in hopes he didn't remember me. "Hi, how can I help you today? How are you?" There goes that idea. He begins to make small talk with me about random things. I politely respond, not getting emotional about anything. Spider-Man then looks at me and asks, "So the other day when I came in, I asked you for a beer recommendation and you told me you weren't of age. I'm just curious, how old are you?" What? I stare at him for a good 5 seconds with a blank expression before responding, "I'm 19. Okay, good to know. You know, I really enjoy talking to you. I love our conversations. Are you comfortable talking with me, or is it more if I have a question about booking?" When I'm conversing with guests, I keep my body very close to the front desk. When talking with Spider-Man, I backed up all the way so I was leaning on the shelving unit that blocked the guest view of our office. Well, I do feel the second way, by the grace of God. He says whatever and walks upstairs to the bar and leaves me alone. My manager was sitting in the office during this whole interaction. I walk back, grab my phone, and make a panicked phone call to my then partner. I go back to the office and tell my manager that I was gonna stay in the back until I knew he was off property. Spider-Man ended up leaving maybe 15 minutes before the end of my shift. The next day, I was scheduled to work at the secondary building. I've had a lot of issues with my department manager, and he ended up being the reason why I left that job. This day in particular, one of my morning coworkers had told me that he was saying things about me to her. Something about me always sitting in the back. 1, we all collectively sat in the back when it was not busy and had never received a guest complaint about this. 2, why are you talking to my coworkers about me? While I was at the secondary building, I needed to have the room keys brought over. We couldn't make keys there, so my manager and supervisor came down. Before they left, I cursed him out, to which he tried saying that he was telling my coworker that I was sitting in the back the day prior because of Spider-Man. I started saying something else, but a guest came to check in, so this was cut short. This interaction had me on edge the whole day. Later on during my shift, I called to have my middle shift coworker bring me some supplies. She calls me when she gets to her car and tells me that she saw and talked to Spider-Man. When she arrives at the secondary building, she tells me about the conversation she had with him. We knew his first name offhand, but I wanted to remember what his last name was. I looked up his first name and first initial of his Latin name in our system, and what do I see but a reservation under his name booked for that night in the secondary building that was checked in 5 minutes prior by the coworker I was with. I turned to her and asked if she checked him in, to which she said no. I called down to the main building and asked my supervisor if she checked him in, to which she did. I informed her that that man was the one who was being weird with me. She hadn't worked on those days he had come in, so she didn't know who he was. Supervisor let me know that she had told Spider-Man that I was up in the secondary building if you need need anything, and he had replied with some compliment about my amazing customer service. The coworker that came over to me had clocked out for her break, but I made her sit at the desk until he arrived. When Spider-Man did come, his face fell as he saw my coworker sitting there instead of myself. He talks to her for a little bit, then makes his way to his room. His was one of the closest to the FD. I don't remember exactly what happened after, but I ended up leaving the secondary building a little before 7 in the afternoon, instead of staying there until 10:30 at night in an attempt to avoid him. Of course, this was no use since he was already aware that I was on property. Eventually, Spider-Man did see me and kept trying to make conversation with myself, as if I didn't already make it clear I had no desire to speak to him in matters unrelated with his stay. He was a very talkative person and kept talking to my supervisor. Already on edge because of the issue with my manager, I needed to let off some steam. I go to the restaurant kitchen and start venting about Spider-Man to the cooks. The manager walks into the kitchen and is like, "Oh, are you talking about Spider-Man? And he's a little weird, but harmless. He talked about you the other day when he came in. I let him know that you are dating someone. You just have to learn when to tell men that you are uninterested. Being a young woman that works in hospitality, it is not uncommon to have guests hit on you from time to time. Whenever that does occur, I will politely tell them that I am not interested." Spider-Man was different. However, he never outwardly said that he was interested in me or wanted to take me out, and I did not want to be one of those girls who assumes everyone is into them. My manager also let me know that Spider-Man was 36. I go back down and try to sit in the office for the remainder of my shift, keeping myself busy with schoolwork, only going out when my supervisor needed another body. Spider-Man was at the desk with my supervisor talking about God knows what. We had temps working in the kitchen who only spoke Spanish. Someone asked for me to go help them since I spoke Spanish. When I came back, he goes, "Oh, you speak Spanish?" He asks in Spanish, "How much does a bottle of water cost?" I reply back in English, $2. I walk back into the office. "Oh, I wanted to talk with you in Spanish." Ignored. I continue doing my schoolwork in the back. My supervisor is up front at the desk taking her 30, still talking to the guy since she didn't want to leave me there with him. I felt bad, even though it was slow, so when a guest came to the desk with a question, I ran out to help them. After assisting the guest, Spider-Man asks, "May I speak with you please?" Again, ignored. Continue doing schoolwork. Supervisor has to walk away from the desk to clock back in. While she's gone, Spider-Man repeats himself, "May I speak with you please?" I'm not sure if it was intentional, but it sounded very authoritative. I go out to the desk. "I'm sorry, I was taking an exam that was timed to due at midnight. Is there anything I can help you with? I just wanted to apologize about asking your age the other day. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just curious." I thanked him, and he continued, "Like I've said before, I love talking to you. I love our conversations. I've been going through something lately, and I feel as though we've really connected." I interrupted him. "May I be honest with you? Sir, there's a certain way I have to interact with everyone I come in contact with while I'm working. We never had a conversation. You were just talking at me. I don't know if you've noticed, but you make me very uncomfortable, and I've been trying to avoid you every time that you've returned." Yes, I have noticed, and I'm curious as to why that is. Now, Spider-Man has never said anything explicit to me, but his vibe is just so off. Since I'm on the clock, I can't just tell him to screw off, so I try explaining myself in the most professional way possible. "Well, you give me a weird vibe. You put me off, to be quite frank with you." "Well, I never did anything inappropriate. Even yesterday when you said that you weren't comfortable talking to me, I just went up to the bar. I'm just trying to express that you make me uncomfortable. I'm trying to set a boundary. I understand that you're trying to set a boundary, but I never did anything inappropriate." At this point, we're going back and forth. He had actually gotten upset with me because I kept calling him sir instead of his first name. My supervisor returns and stands at the other end of the desk silently, letting me blow up on this guy. Spider-Man is just not getting the hint, you guys. Remember how the manager told me he was 36? I end up telling him, "For a man that is old enough to be my father, you should know well enough not to flirt with a 19-year-old. The face this man made. He looks at me, over to my supervisor, and back at me, and goes flirting. I was never flirting, and I don't think you know how old I am, but for Mr. to have been your father, I would have had to have you at—" This guy literally stands there counting on his fingers. 17 years old. Is that impossible? People literally have kids at 14. When I'm upset, my voice will get progressively louder. Spider-Man puts his hands up and says there is no need for you to yell at me. I'm standing right here. I snap back with, "If you have any issue with the way I am speaking to you, you can contact my manager manager. His card is right there. We don't need to escalate this. Eventually, I say to him, "Sir, you make me very uncomfortable. It feels as though you are coming back in specifically to see me, and for that I would prefer if you don't come back again. I was at FDA and had no authority to ban anyone, so this wasn't an official thing. More so me expressing my feelings. I have every right to come back here. Yes, sir, you do have every right to come back here, just as I have every right to leave this conversation. Have a wonderful night." I stomp back into the office. Spider-Man begins ranting about me to my supervisor, being all I never did anything wrong. She's overacting. My supervisor is just giving him the head nod because she knows everything that happened and that this was out of character for me in terms of guest relations. Spider-Man tries going up to the bar, realizes it closed for the night, and walks out of the building. My supervisor had to take over all of the end of shift duties, so I didn't have to be at the desk. Night Audit comes in, and as I try to explain what happened, Spider-Man walks back in. Night Audit goes out and greets him. "What is your position here?" Spider-Man gruffly asks. Night Audit replies in a matter-of-fact tone. Night Audit. Spider-Man asks for my supervisor, who is unavailable, so he tries waiting a few minutes, but ends up leaving for the night. I ended up having Night Audit and my supervisor's partner walk me out to my car that night to make sure he wasn't waiting for me or anything. I had off the day after I blew up on Spider-Man. Following my supervisor's advice, I texted my manager asking if I could call him at some point in the day about what had happened. We agreed to call around 1 in the afternoon as I was attending classes in the morning. My morning coworker had texted me after I got out of class. Here is our conversation. My morning manager, he is here complaining about you, so I'm trying to eavesdrop. I went off on him yesterday in front of I'm talking to my manager in an hour or so. Let me know what happens. My morning manager, I will, and I think he heard me warning our sales coordinator about it today, so it's about me too, but is taking his side so far, so that's fun. My morning manager, this man is telling you had feelings for him. What? My morning manager, he is describing to about how you guys were having banter and said you shouldn't do that if you don't want anything. We never bantered though. Given all of this new information, I was able to provide more evidence to my manager about Spider-Man. Surprisingly, my manager actually took the situation seriously. Yeah, no, I'll ban him when I'm back in tomorrow. That's my first win in a while. After I got off the phone with my morning manager, I called and texted my other coworkers, giving them a full debrief on Spider-Man. The morning coworker that had texted me about him let me know that he was hanging around her as well. She comes in for her shift at 7 in the morning, and he was hanging around in the lobby of the main building, so not even the building he was staying in, for a while. My morning coworker also told me that our manager was not aware that she had overheard his conversation with Spider-Man. My manager had a whole conversation with me about he was a safe man, and my manager didn't realize I was there when they were having the conversation and came back and told me completely different things than what I heard them talking about. This part I'm not 100% I heard right, but I'm pretty sure my manager told the guy you owed him an apology. The next day, I came in for my shift at 3 in the afternoon. My morning coworker lets me know that Spider-Man was waiting in the lobby for her that day. He was there when she came in and kept trying to talk to her. Night Audit stayed with her until around 8 in the morning when our morning manager came. Spider-Man would come over to the desk, realize she was there, would walk off for a few minutes, rinse repeat. Eventually, he checked out with the both of them. Spider-Man handed them his room keys. It was like I'm expecting a written letter of apology from her. He and my morning manager actually crossed paths in the parking lot. When my morning manager came in, she was like, "That's the guy. He's weird." Anyway, my morning manager pulls my other manager and supervisor into his office for a little bit, then grabs me. He basically was like, "You need to protect yourself. Why would you entertain the conversation with him for that long?" If I wasn't on the clock, I basically would have told him to screw off. I can't be rude to guests. If someone is acting like that, I'm perfectly fine with you telling them whatever so they can leave you alone. Oh, word. So my manager was the one who made the call telling him he wasn't allowed back. What was funny is that whenever my manager was on the phone, he would always have it on speaker. This time, he held that phone up to his ear and was speaking very low, so I couldn't hear the conversation. He told me that Spider-Man was all but I love staying with you guys on the phone. I ended up leaving that property in early December. Luckily, I had accepted a higher paying position at the hotel in the local military base. Since Spider-Man had mentioned that he had been staying at that hotel, I was very nervous about accepting the position in fear that I would see him again. My first or second day, I was hanging around the office when a reservations agent got off of the phone with a difficult guest. Agent and supervisor who was training me began talking about difficult and weird guests. I had asked them if they knew someone by the name of Spider-Man. Supervisor turns to me in disbelief and says, "Yes, we banned him." What? She brings me into my manager's office and they tell me the whole story. Manager explains that Spider-Man came and stayed with them in early September and was being very odd. He owed some people money and they were after him, so he was trying to be stealth by staying in our hotel since we were located in a military base. You needed to show identification before being let in. He kept on pestering the employees about knowing if these guys had come come in looking for him, and that they should be verifying everyone's identifications as they enter our hotel. Quite literally, none of us were paid enough to do that, nor cared, as if that was anyone's job. He would hang around in the lobby areas for a while and just kept bothering the employees. Someone had let me know that he had actually come in with a woman who appeared to be around his age, if anyone was wondering, and a few days later he came to the desk and said that she had broken up with him, and he didn't understand why. Spider-Man had even mailed a copy of both of his books addressed to one of the supervisors to the hotel. I think some of the valet mentioned that he may or may not be racist, which I'm not sure of, as I myself am visibly a person of color, and so was my old manager. Given all of this, my manager went to the higher manager and was like, something needs to be done about this guy. My higher ranking manager went to Spider-Man's room, told him he needed to leave and was no longer welcome for the next 3 months. He waited in the door while Spider-Man packed his belongings up, which he didn't even have a suitcase. All of his things were in laundry baskets and garbage bags. I tell them everything that happened at my previous hotel with Spider-Man. So according to the timeline, he stayed at the military base hotel first, got banned, and then stayed at my previous property. Since there were only 3 actual hotels in the area that I worked, 2 of them being properties I had worked at, and the other one being a chain hotel, I wanted to know if he was banned from the 3rd hotel as well. Spider-Man was to call my higher ranking manager before he came back to check and see if he was good to return on property. He did call a few times, but my higher ranking manager let him know that he was permitted to return. Luckily, I have not seen him since I blew up on him in October. A funny bit for you all, the employees at the military hotel actually held onto the books he mailed in, and I read one of them during a boring shift. This book was horrible. I could open my butt, take a dump on a page, publish it, and it would be better than what he wrote. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. This story happened when I was about 13 or 14. I grew up in a town with a lot of walking and biking trails in a forest area about a 10-minute walk from my house, so I spent a lot of time outside. One of my best friends, we'll call him Anthony, lived in the neighborhood across from mine. I would frequently walk to his house to knock on his door and see whether he wanted to join me in biking aimlessly around town. On this particular day, he decided to join me and we went down to the local lake, an extremely popular spot during the summer. It's never empty. There's a trail right next to the local library which leads to the lake. We decided to hang out by the trail entrance as it was right next to a tunnel that ran under the street above, providing good shade and amplification for listening to music together off our iPods. This tunnel is probably a good 20 feet long or so, with the only easy path back up to the street above being the paved one on one side. The trail itself is gravel, with trees on both sides, no easy way to get off with a bike unless you use the designated entrances and exits. Anthony and I were hanging out on the opposite side of the tunnel from the trail entrance so as not to bother any families getting on the trail with our music. We had our bikes leaned up on the side of the tunnel when I noticed a man coming through the opposite end, right next to the trail entrance. He entered the tunnel and, once he was about 15 feet away, called out, "I may insert our city name here, police officer." It didn't take more than a 2-second glance to tell that he wasn't. He was wearing cargo shorts, a green tank top, sandals, and a big military style backpack. Even from about 15 feet away, I could tell that his skin looked really greasy. His hair was unkempt. I immediately knew something bad was about to happen and my adrenaline started to rush. I turned to my friend and just yelled at him, "Anthony, run," to which he got on his bike and began to ride off. The man was standing between us and the trail entrance, so there was no easy way for us to take off without either needing to go directly past him or down the trail in the opposite direction. Anthony chose to try for the main entrance that the man was blocking. As he rode past, the man reached out and grabbed his arm. Anthony sort of stopped, but the man was more focused on me and ended up letting go, to which Anthony quickly took off. I knew I wouldn't be as lucky as Anthony was if I tried to push my way past the man, so I immediately started looking for other ways to run. I noticed that there was actually a small dirt trail on the same end of the tunnel that we had been. I tried to take my bike up it and the man yelled out behind me, "Didn't your parents ever teach you not to run from the cops?" The trail grew too small for me to carry my bike down, so I just dropped it on the ground and continued running, hoping that this side trail led back up to the street where he at least wouldn't be able to hurt me without witnesses. He chased me about halfway down the trail but eventually turned around. I ended up coming out at the library and quickly ran to the top of the tunnel so that I could see what he was doing. All I saw was him riding off on my bike. I called the cops and they came to my house to give me a lineup after I walked home. I instantly identified the guy. Apparently he and his twin brother were homeless and on meth, which would explain his demeanor and motivation. They were known for stealing bikes in the area but never so brazenly. I was just glad that the situation wasn't worse because based on his substance use he very easily could have chosen violence at the drop of a hat. To the fake cop that stole my bike, let's not meet. The incident I'm about to share was when I was 21 years old. I'm a dude, so I'm part of an online friend group on Discord. We're all from the same country, but most of us are from different cities. Only 2 other people are from the same city as me. Everything was going fine between us until suddenly there were a series of unfortunate incidents where I had minor fallouts with them. I went through personal frustrations and I unknowingly projected them onto people on the server. These fallouts continued over April and May until one day I left the group in a frenzy. Side note, I admit I was pretty childish in how I acted with the group. I remember to apologize to all the people there for my actions, and most of them forgave me. Afterward, the night before June began, one of the people, let's call him Person 1, texted me asking if I knew certain people from my high school. I told him I did. I asked Person 1 how he knew them, and he revealed to me that he knew a lot of people from there. Suddenly, the conversation took a dark turn. Person 1 started talking to me in a sinister tone, telling me he had some of my personal information, what college I went to, my route to college, who I hung out with both in my old high school and college, and he even claimed to have some of the photos from my personal Instagram. When I asked him how he had all of that, he claimed he had tailed my car and kept repeating the phrase the people at your college are bad at providing information. At that point, I was scared to death. He told me if I didn't return to the group and if I didn't apologize to a specific person, let's call her Person 2, the girl he threatened me over, he'd first dox me and then wait outside my college to kidnap and kill me. After the conversation ended, I rejoined the Discord group out of fear and then went to bed. The next couple of days were rough. The fear of what Person 1 could do to me gripped me tightly. I lost my energy and motivation, the ability to engage in my usual day-to-day interests, and I even lost my appetite for food. My family and friends both noticed that something was wrong with me. I was too scared to even tell other people about what was going on. Fearing for your safety is a fate I wouldn't even wish on my worst enemy. Normally, death threats like these wouldn't scare me, but what made this situation different were the following points. Person 1 lived in the same city as me and relatively close to my neighborhood. Before this incident and my fallouts, he'd often tell us stories of how he got into major gang fights and dangerous situations. I had never received serious death threats before. I've pretty much been safe my whole life. Since this was my first time facing such a situation, it seriously traumatized me. A couple of days later, I contacted Person 1 again and begged him to stop dictating me like that. Finally, he revealed to me his reason for scaring me. He told me he wanted to humble me so I stopped being too moody in the group and rejoined. He said he wasn't dictating me anymore, but still wanted me to remember the conditions he put on me as a request this time, and not a threat. The situation was technically over after that. I did talk to other people from the group, including Person 2, about what Person 1 did to me, and they all responded the same way. They assured me that Person 1's threats seemed mostly empty and that everything was okay. None of them approved of what Person 1 had done, but I also told them not to talk to him about it out of fear for my safety. I know that was probably a stupid move on my part. This whole ordeal left me shocked. Even though Person 1 told me he wasn't dictating me anymore, the effects of the whole situation took a toll on me. It's been a month and a half since this happened, but it still hasn't left me. My image of the group has been tainted. Every time I come across the Discord server and see Person 1 and others, my heart suddenly fills with dread. I've been thinking about leaving the group one day, but right now I feel stuck. Normally, people would tell you to cut abusive friends off, but I find that difficult because he's part of the same group, and everyone else in the group has been incredibly kind and supportive of me. My mind keeps telling me that cutting Person 1 off means cutting everyone else off. Secondly, yes, I do have the option of just cutting him off on my private socials, but I'm scared that he might threaten me again, even though he never implied he was going to force me to stay friends with him. So this is my present situation. I'm stuck in a friend group that I don't want to be part of anymore because one of the people in that group thought it was a good idea to humble me by traumatizing me with threats. I know that leaving the group is the best thing for me, but I'm too scared of what's going to happen to me if I do so. I keep thinking about how peaceful life would have been had I not made the mistake of joining their Discord server all those months ago. My incident with Person 1 has made me realize just how evil some people can be. I want to avoid him, but because of my paranoia, I sometimes force myself to engage with the group normally. I don't ever want to meet Person 1 or interact with him in any way. I want to cut him off and forget about him completely, but I don't see any way out as of right now. It feels like I was slowly lured into a cage and immediately imprisoned the moment I settled in. I know very well that leaving the group is the right option for me right now because if I don't, my mental health will continue to decline, but I need help in finally achieving that goal. When I was 14, I worked at a McDonald's that was connected to a gas station. It was a truck stop, so it was very busy 90% of the time. The only downside to working at a truck stop fast food place was that the bathroom was on the complete other side of the building. I was a freshman in high school. At the time I was pretty small, maybe not in height but in size. I was around 5'6" and anywhere from 130 to 150 pounds. Not super tiny, but small enough to where I probably have made an easy target. This wasn't a fear of mine, however, but maybe it should have been. I remember I was in gym class. It was maybe the middle of the school day, and it was one of those days where we could just sit on the side and catch up on work for other classes if we didn't want to participate in the game. My friends and I did this almost all the time, and almost never actually worked on anything important. We were laughing and joking around until I received Power School notifications my school iPad excusing me from the remaining classes of the day. I was really confused, considering my mom hadn't mentioned anything about picking me up early, and I was only seeing my dad every other weekend, and he wasn't the type to pick me up from school. I was grounded, so I didn't have a phone with me other than a cheap flip phone my mom had gotten me from Walmart. I texted her about the notifications, but before I got a response back from her, my gym teacher told me I needed to grab my things and go to the office because my mom would be picking me up. This confused me even more, and I shot my mom another text asking if she was picking me up from school. She freaked out and told me not to leave the building. At this point, I was sitting in the office by the window, waiting for apparently nobody to come pick me up until the situation was figured out. My mom ended up calling the school and letting them know I wasn't allowed to leave with anyone that day. Apparently, whoever called claimed to be my mom and said they were coming to pick me up. As far as I know, nobody ever showed up to pick me up, and I didn't hear anything else about it. My mom wasn't comfortable with me working at a truck stop, and we got my location switched to a McDonald's that was closer in town and wasn't connected to a gas station. What we think might have happened is someone saw my name tag and possibly called all the schools in the area until they found me, but I still have no idea how they would have known my last name. With that being said, creepy stranger who pretended to be my mom over the phone and tried to pull me out of school, let's not meet. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. The story I'm going to tell you happened over the course of roughly 5 or 6 years. Names have, of course, been changed. When I was in college, I met this dude named Steve. He was good looking, well spoken, and confident. He was instantly well liked by most of the people that he met, but was a bit intimidating to me at first due to the fact that he was pretty jacked and didn't speak to me a whole lot in the beginning. Here I was, an 18 going on 19 fat kid with an inferiority complex that made me act out to get attention. I would wear women's clothes to class to get a laugh, or interrupt the professors with a witticism here and a joke there, again for a laugh. I was that kid, the one that people didn't exactly dislike, but weren't too eager to hang out with because I could be a bit much at times. This did nothing to help with my feelings of inadequacy, but I didn't make the connection there until a couple years later. Steve and I didn't exactly become fast and hard friends because I got pretty drunk at a party once and he decided instantly that I was annoying. Still, we were civil to each other as we were in the same department and had a couple of classes together. We kind of hung with different crowds too, even inside the department. Steve had recently been kicked out of boot camp in the military. He told everyone that it was because he had injured himself badly enough that he had been discharged, but that wasn't true. However, we'll get to that part later. Cut to about 3 or 4 months after my first meeting Steve, and I had been invited by a mutual friend, Corey, to come to a small get-together at his place where he incidentally was roommates with Steve. I told Corey that I was kind of wary of Steve and felt like he didn't like me, to which he replied that I was right and that was why he wanted me to come over. He wanted me and Steve to get to know each other better because he was positive we would become friends if we just gave each other a chance. After some more prodding, I finally agreed. When I arrived at Corey's house, there were maybe 3 other people from the department there. It seemed like a pretty chill setting. There was some alcohol being passed around and I drank a little bit, but I kept my distance from Steve. After a couple hours and quite a few beers, I was starting to feel pretty good. Someone brought out a couple of joints and those started getting passed around the room. When one of them made its way to me, Steve spoke up. "Don't bother passing to him," he said with a mocking laugh. "He's a goody good." I'm not exactly sure why he said or even thought that. It might have been because I once mentioned in passing that I had never smoked weed before. Regardless of why he said it, it made me mad that he was making fun of me. So I did what any 19-year-old drunk dude would do. I grabbed the joint and took the biggest hit I could possibly take. This, as anyone who has ever smoked knows, is a huge mistake for a marijuana virgin when quality kush is handed to him. After my coughing fit and all of the laughter at my expense had subsided, I looked at Steve challengingly and he just kind of nodded nodded in my direction before resuming his conversation. Now, no one told me that you shouldn't mix alcohol and weed. Had I stopped there, I would have been fine. However, I continued to drink, which exacerbated all the stuff that comes along with being high. By the time I knew I was high, I was starting to get paranoid. I am, or at least was, a bit of a hypochondriac. Dry mouth felt like my tongue was swelling up and my throat was starting to close. The feeling of almost weightlessness that sometimes accompanies being high made me feel like I wasn't anchored to the floor anymore. The time dilation that you experience with weed made me feel like I was literally frozen in time. I started to panic. By this point, everyone else had gone home and it was just me, Steve, and Corey. I explained to Corey that I thought I was allergic to weed because I wasn't feeling right, and oddly enough, Steve asked me to explain what I was feeling. When I did, he walked me through all of it and calmed me down. Once I was calm, he put a controller in my hands and we played video games until I sobered up enough to drive. It was honestly really cool of him, and it was the start of one of the best friendships I've ever had until it became the worst, most abusive relationship I've ever been in. Over the next year or so, Steve and I became really close. I considered him one of my best friends. Being around him was almost like a drug. He just had this way of making you feel like you mattered. I know now that he was a complete sociopath, but you don't really see those signs until it's too late. He harassed me until I started working out with him, which meant I had more energy and confidence in myself. I got into pretty decent shape. I wasn't ripped. I wasn't even what most people would call fit, but I wasn't the fat kid anymore either. He would come to my house and force me to go out and do stuff. Before I became friends with him, I was kind of a loner and a hermit. We would go to the lake just to screw around, or go hiking in the woods, or any number of outdoorsy type activities. For the first time in years, I had confidence in myself and I was actually quite happy. Enter Lisa. Lisa was the love of my life, the one who got away, or rather the one that I stupidly dumped twice over a 5-year relationship because I was scared. She's not a huge part of the Ballad of Steve, but she plays a role. She had come to my hometown to go to school, and she had a boyfriend back home, but we clicked immediately. I know you're wondering, and no, we didn't hook up or anything while she was with him. She made her intentions toward me clear, and I made it clear that nothing would happen while she was dating someone else. She told me that she had been considering breaking things off with him as he was a bit controlling and a jerk, and the next day she walked up to me and kissed me full on the mouth. When I started to push her away, she laughed and said, "I broke up with Jason last night. You're my Dell." I smiled back and our relationship began. I apologize for getting into these details that have nothing to do with Steve. It was just an immensely happy time of my life, and I never would have had the confidence to flirt with Lisa in the first place if it weren't for Steve. The next year after Lisa and I got together was rather uneventful. I will admit there were some red flags with Steve that I either didn't see or just outright ignored. Looking back on it now, one of the most obvious signs was that one day I was hanging out with Lisa when Steve showed up. She had always gotten a bad vibe from him, rightly so, and so when he showed up she left to go to class 45 minutes early. Watching her walk away, Steve said, "I could take her from you if I wanted." I gave him an incredulous look, slightly panicking that this man who called himself my friend might actually want to, and be able to, sway Lisa to date him instead. He laughed at my expression and added, "Don't worry, I don't want her. She's like a 6 at best. She's perfect for you, but just thought you should know that if I wanted, I could take her from you." It should be noted that Lisa was absolutely gorgeous in a very classical way. I am now convinced that Steve actually was attracted to her. I did get angry and told him not to talk to her about my girlfriend in such a gross manner, but once he gave a half-hearted apology, I just kind of shrugged it off. The next year there were even more red flags that I chose to ignore. I know the story is moving rather quickly right now, but those first couple of years weren't really that bad. Yes, Steve was starting to show his true colors, but the really bad stuff was still to come. Also, if you're keeping track, I was at a 2-year college for 3 years. That's just how long it took me to get my associate's degree. That's neither here nor there. Steve started dating one of the freshmen in our department. I heard from others that the relationship was incredibly psychologically abusive on his end, but I kept brushing it off because the girl he was dating hadn't spoken up and Steve was a good guy, right? I mean, I hadn't witnessed it. Other people must just be misinterpreting Steve's unusual sense of humor in a way that painted him in a bad light in their minds. I was unaware at the time that of course she wouldn't speak out against him because that's what psychological abuse is. It's gaslighting and insults and ensuring that the victim believes themselves to be absolutely worthless and deserving of the treatment that they receive. During the end of year departmental party, I proposed to Lisa and she said yes. When Lisa and I graduated from the college with an associate's degree, we decided to move to a new school together. Despite the fact that our relationship grew stronger than ever without Steve in our lives, a dot that I didn't connect due to still being firmly in his psychotic grasp, the college we decided to transfer to was absolute garbage, and after the year was over we had decided to transfer again. again to a better and cheaper school, this time about an hour away. Coincidentally, it was the same school that Steve now attended. That summer, Lisa moved back to her hometown while transitioning between schools, and I ended things with her for the first time over the phone. Bad, I know, but we were like 5 hours apart since I had stayed behind to live on campus and work, and neither of us could find the time to visit the other. The only reason I can logically come up with is that I was scared of the commitment. I've always said that when I marry, I want it to be for life. I got in my own head and started to worry about whether or not Lisa was the person I really wanted to spend the rest of my life with. When I moved to the new city, Steve helped me get an apartment in the same complex where he and Corey, the friend from earlier, both lived. We were in separate buildings, but the apartments were set up in a way that the courtyard between the two buildings was only like 40 feet across. I could actually see into Steve's basement apartment window from my second floor one when we both had our blinds open. There were many times that I would glance out the window while playing video games or something, and Steve would catch my eye and wave me over, so I would obediently turn my game off and head over to his place to smoke a little weed and watch one of his 4 DVDs for the billionth time. During this time in my life, I became a major alcoholic. I'm fairly certain that Steve realized this was happening, but said nothing because he wanted to be able to hold it over me later. He may have contributed to my alcoholism a bit. He began to use the same bullying tactics he had once employed to get me to work out and go do things. This time he was using them to get me to go out drinking. If I told him that I had class early the next day or homework that needed doing, he would just wave it off and tell me we would be back in plenty of time for me to get my homework done or get plenty of sleep. We would often stay out until 2 in the morning when the bars closed, or later if he met someone cool and decided we were going to go to their house to hang for a bit afterward. If I said I didn't have money, he would promise to pay for me. At the end of the night, I would get a bill I could barely afford, and he would explain that clearly he meant he would pay for the first couple of rounds, and if I drank more than that, it was my fault. Several times I had to borrow money from him to pay rent, which further put me in his control. I would like to take a brief break and address the elephant in the room. I realized that every single one of the previously mentioned problems stemmed from me. I could have moderated my drinking. I could have told him no when he asked me to go out. I could have realized sooner that he was never truly going to pay my bar tab, or that we weren't going to be home early. I take responsibility for all of these things. That being said, something you have to understand about Steve is that he would gaslight and make me feel like I was being a bad friend if I told him no, despite having a very valid reason for the refusal. What I'm trying to do by telling you this part is point out that he was never the good friend that I thought he was, or he would have pointed out that I was drinking too much. Would it have stopped me, as I know now from the numerous attempts by another really true friend? No, it wouldn't have, but at least in hindsight I would be able to say, you know, Steve tried to get me to stop drinking. He was a good friend. Back to the story. Some few months after moving to the new city, Steve introduced me to a friend of his from out of town, Jennifer. She was a very pretty woman with dyed red hair, styled into a pixie cut. She was thin, with an athletic build and a gorgeous face. She was honestly every straight man's dream. Not only that, but she was intelligent, funny, quick-witted, compassionate, and kind. I instantly developed a crush on her, but I was sure she was out of my league. I asked Steve if she was seeing anyone though, because at this point I still had some confidence. He told me she wasn't and asked if I liked her. I said yes, and he assured me that he would try to get a feel for what she thought of me. Cut to a few days later, and Steve is now dating her. This confused me, because when he introduced us, they kept making jokes about how neither of them was really interested in the other and they would never work as a couple. I think even back then I knew that he had done his psychological games to get her to date him so he could, once again, assert his dominance over me. I shrugged it off, happy that my friend had finally found a girl to make him forget that freshman he had been dating a couple years ago. He had constantly moaned about missing her when she finally got the courage to tell him to screw off one night after he had called her fat. She was maybe 95 pounds. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice that Jennifer was looking more and more exhausted and haggard. When I asked if she was okay, she would just smile and assure me that her workload was just getting to her. We had started to become friends, so I asked her not to hesitate in coming to me if there was anything I could do to help her out. She thanked me for the kind gesture, but again said she would be fine. I would later find out that Steve was treating her just the same as he had treated his previous girlfriend. She apparently told Steve about my offer for help, thinking it was sweet that I wanted to help her, and as you might guess, Steve flew off the handle. I had never seen him so angry. He came to my apartment banging on the door fit to break it down and screaming at me to get my two-faced self out in the hallway so he could kill me. I didn't know it at the time, but Steve had started taking steroids, which explained part of his unfounded rage. After nearly an hour of him pacing my living room, threatening me and yelling loud enough to wake the whole neighborhood, I was finally able to convince him that my intentions were nothing but friendly toward Jennifer now. I wasn't going to pursue her since she had dated one of my best friends. Once he finally believed that I wasn't trying to stuff his girl like a Thanksgiving turkey, as he put it. It was like a switch was flipped. Suddenly we were best friends again, and his earlier rage seemed to have been forgotten as if it had never happened. He dumped Jennifer shortly after. My guess is that he realized I had no romantic interest in her anymore, and therefore couldn't use his relationship with her to needle me and control me. I only saw her a handful of times after that, but the last time I saw her she looked so much happier. Yet another sign about Steve I either didn't see or chose to ignore. About a month after the yelling incident, Lisa and I got back together. She was incredibly distrustful and wary of me at this point, and rightly so. I had broken her heart for no other reason than that I was an idiot. Over time, she began to trust me with her emotions again. This was a mistake on her part, and I don't mean that to sound cruel. Perhaps I had picked up some things from Steve. I know that I was fairly manipulative. I am more ashamed of that than I could ever portray with words. I hate myself to this day for some of the ways I treated her during our second stint as a couple. Lisa was still uncomfortable around Steve, and she would often leave if we were hanging out and Steve showed up. He never seemed to catch on that she didn't want to be around him. Things were made far worse when we went to a house party one night and Steve groped her. Again, I am incredibly ashamed to admit what I did when she came to me in tears of rage and disgust and told me what happened. I am ashamed because the first thing out of my mouth was, "Steve wouldn't do that. Maybe you just misunderstood what was going on." He grabbed my chest. She practically yelled at me. "Alright," I said, "I'll go talk to you." I should have just cut him out right then and there. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. I should have taken Lisa home. I should have went and knocked Steve out. I should have done a lot of things, but I've always been a people pleaser, and Steve brought this out in me in the worst way. When I asked Steve about the situation, he told me that he had grabbed her waist to get around her in the kitchen, which was crowded, and that he had accidentally brushed up against her while reaching for a bottle of rum. I believed him. I went back to Lisa and conveyed what had been told to me. After a lot more enraged tears and yelling, she left. Why she didn't just dump my stupid, harassment apologist, victim blaming self right then, I still don't know. When Steve appeared a few minutes later and I explained what had happened, he put on a faux sympathetic face and said with a chuckle, "Man, screw her. Let's find somebody better for you." Even back then I knew that that was a huge red flag, but I still ignored the signs. I didn't cheat, but I ignored the signs. Lisa didn't speak to me for a week, and she was right to do so. She should have never spoken to me again. For the next few months, things with Steve were a bit strained and we didn't hang out much. Things with Lisa improved again now that Steve wasn't around as much. We were even talking about moving in together. This would not ever happen because I was going to break up with her again before long. I didn't know I was going to do this at the time, but it was going to happen. When it did happen, there were no tears like the last time. There was no pleading that we could make it work. Lisa simply fixed me with an emotionless, almost dead gaze and said, "My sister told me not to trust you again. I should have listened. Get your stuff and get out of my apartment." Now I really wish that she had just left it at that, but over the next couple of years we would go on to have a few stints as friends with benefits as we both knew what the other wanted in bed, and it was just easier for both of us, I think, to find comfort with each other when we wanted. I obviously obliged. There were no feelings in it for her. We never got back together, but we became a sort of facsimile of friends again after a while. Shortly after our breakup, I became immensely depressed. I didn't realize that it was because I was still in love with Lisa. Why would I be? I had broken things off with her. Regardless, I started drinking even more and stopped working out. I started regaining all the weight I had lost my freshman year of college, and Steve noticed, often remarking that I was a fat. I never really minded it because I was used to my weight being the butt of every other joke. Besides, he always said it with a laugh to let me know that he was only joking, the way good friends always insult each other, right? At the same time, I started hanging out with him again. One day he came to me asking if I wanted to move into a house with him. I politely declined because I liked living alone, and my rent was relatively cheap for where I lived. He got unreasonably angry, saying that I owed him everything. He proceeded to scream at me for half an hour. He didn't speak to me for 3 days, but did eventually calm down. He never apologized for his ridiculous outburst though. When he moved out, another mutual friend took his apartment after having just gone through a bad breakup of his own, and I started hanging out with this new friend, Mark, quite a bit since he was just across the courtyard and Steve was a couple miles away. During this time, I met a man through Mark who would go on to become one of the 2 best friends that I have ever had, and one of the most amazing people I've ever known. Enter Nick. Remember the friend from earlier who I said regularly tried to get me to stop drinking? That's Nick. He was in as a man who, for some reason, I never want to disappoint. point. Even today, being mostly sober, a huge part of what keeps me from drinking is the idea that if Nick found out, I would be more ashamed of myself than if I publicly pooped my pants in front of the woman of my dreams. Personally, that to me is a mark of a true friend, mostly because Nick never asked for or expected me to feel this way. In fact, I think he's a little uncomfortable with it, but it's not something I can just turn off. Nick and I hit it off fairly quickly and started hanging out regularly. It was with Nick and his circle of friends, all of whom I proudly now call my own friends, that a Dungeons and Dragons group was started that lasted for nearly 4 years. Nick plays a bigger, if not huge, part in this story later. Things continued this way for maybe half a year before I finally decided to take Steve up on his offer and move into the house with him, mostly because money was tight and my bills would go down. His current roommates had moved away for whatever reason and he had a couple of vacancies. I took one room, and a friend of his from when he was in boot camp, Greg, took the other. For a while, things were awesome. Steve had apparently become Catholic. He was off the juice. It was like I had my old friend back from the days when we had first started becoming chummy. He, Greg, and I would often go on road trips or go out to bars or just go to some outdoor attractions around the city and walk around. Now, remember that I said that Steve had been discharged from the military and claimed that it was due to an injury. Turns out that was not true at all. One night while Steve was at work, Greg and I were hanging out with some beers and somehow the topic came up. You know he was crazy? Yeah. Greg asked, what do you mean? I said, he was kicked out before he finished boot camp. Really? He told me that he suffered some kind of injury and they had to let him go. After I said this, an incredulous look came over Greg's face and he turned slowly to look at me. He then proceeded to tell me that what Steve had told me was an utter lie. He told me that Steve had reason to suspect that his then wife was cheating on him and had been overheard by a commanding officer saying that when he finished with boot camp he was going to murder them both and the daughter that he and his wife had. He had been given an in-depth psychological evaluation and been discharged essentially for being quote-unquote too insane for the military. I later confirmed this with some of Steve's childhood friends. At this point, I was starting to realize who Steve really was, thinking back on some of the interactions I had with him. Unfortunately, I was stupidly loyal to someone I perceived to be a good friend. At some point, I had invited Nick to come over and hang out to play video games and whatnot, and when Steve met Nick, he immediately called him fat. Now, Nick was at the time a large man. He has since made enormous strides in his fitness journey. Shout out to Nick for your hard work if you're reading this. You look great. Regardless, I remember the look of utter disbelief on Nick's face, but I defended Steve by saying that was just how he made friends. If he wasn't calling you names, then it meant he didn't like you. By the way, can we stop that stuff? Treating people like crap as a way to break the ice is terrible. I'm guilty of it in the past, and I hate that I used to do it. Anyway, not relevant. I could tell Nick was skeptical, but he just kind of went with it. I think he kind of resented me for not defending him, but he never said so. I don't blame him if he did. A few weeks after the conversation with Greg, Steve had a friend of his from out of town stay with us for a weekend. Greg was out of town for work or something. I forget the details as they aren't important. Before this friend of Steve's arrived, he told me that she was fat, but pretty, and if I wanted to bone down with her, I had his blessing. This did not sit well with me, not only because of how he described her, which I learned wasn't true when she arrived, but because he felt the need to give his permission for two of his friends to get in bed with each other. I kept my mouth shut, though I forget the woman's name, but she was a very pretty woman. I was confused as to why Steve would describe her as such. She and I got along really well from the start. That night, she and Steve slept together. Again, I'm fairly certain he slept with her because he could tell I was taking a liking to her. I wasn't falling over myself to get into a relationship with her, but I did like her quite a bit. Steve had to once again assert his dominance over me. The next day, we all had lunch at a local restaurant, and Steve essentially left his friend and myself to drive his car back to the house while he wandered off to do whatever knows what. I was infuriated that he would do that. Not necessarily the leave us part, but the fact that his friend had come to town specifically to visit him and he just bailed on her with no real reason. She and I spent the day watching movies and playing video games. We talked quite a bit about Steve as he was our one common link, and a lot of things came to light about Steve that I won't mention here simply because I don't want to be typing this for the next 2 weeks. I texted Steve multiple times throughout the day asking where he was. He didn't respond until about midnight when I sent a text telling him it was kind of crappy of him to just leave his friend with me when she had come to see him. The text I got back just read, "Mind your business, fatty. I'll be home when I get home." He finally rolled up around 10 the next morning as his friend was getting ready to leave. He was driving a motorcycle that I had never seen before. He barely said goodbye to the woman as she was leaving, and when the door was shut, I rounded on him. "Where were you, dude?" I demanded, feeling myself getting angrier by the word at what he had done. Not that it's any of your business, but I was helping a friend bury a body," he shot back as he walked into his room. I knew instantly that this was a lie. I had this intuition when it came to Steve. I could almost always tell when he was lying, and this one was just so outlandish that I didn't even need to consider it to know it was absolute crap. "No, you weren't," I said under my breath. "What was that?" "Fatty," he said, coming back into the room shirtless and getting in my face. I gently pushed him away from me and he looked utterly dumbfounded. He couldn't believe I would ever stand up to him like this. "I said you're lying," I retorted quickly, enunciating, "but if you want to treat your friends like crap when they travel 4 hours just to hang out with you for a couple of days, then be my guest." We stood there glaring at each other for a few seconds before he deflated and looked slightly ashamed, which shocked me. "I was with a girl I've been dating," he said softly. "So you invited a friend to stay with us?" I said, my anger rising again. "Cheated on your girlfriend with her, bailed on us, and then lied to me about it. You're a real douchebag." I turned on my heel and stormed up to my room. I'm fairly certain Steve threw something at me but missed, because I heard a thump on the wall just to the left of the doorway as I walked through. I didn't stop to find out. I didn't see or speak to Steve for a couple of days after that. It wasn't until Greg came home from his trip and noticed that we weren't spending time together and were acting coldly toward one another that our friendship started to repair a bit. Most of that was due to Greg yelling at us that he wasn't going to live with a couple of people who couldn't get their stuff together and act like adults. Despite our relationship repairing slightly, things were never really the same after that. Over the next few months, Steve started to sell drugs and always kept a loaded gun in the house. I specifically remember him telling me one day that some guy was going to be coming over to give him some money that he was owed, and if he showed up while Steve was at work, I was supposed to take the money, count it, and put it on his bedroom desk. I didn't know he was dealing at the time, and so assumed it was just a guy who owed him money. I just agreed and went back to playing my video game as he left for work. Steve got home from work before the guy showed up, and when there was a knock on the door, Steve came out of his bedroom with his gun in hand and held a finger to his lips. He opened the door to reveal a man standing on the porch with a wad of cash in hand. Steve immediately pointed the gun in his face, cocked the hammer back, and started screaming at him to drop the money on the ground and get off his porch. As the dude was fleeing in terror, Steve yelled after him that if he ever saw him again, he would kill him. Of course, I was immediately distressed by what I had just witnessed, but I was equally terrified. When he turned to me with a huge grin after collecting the money from the porch and closing the door, I just gave a weak smile and ignored the whole thing. I learned later that he was back on steroids when this happened. During this time, Steve would regularly come home late at night, 3 sheets to the wind, ranting about one ethnic group or another. The one that sticks out in my mind the most was when he stumbled and so drunk that he could barely string together a coherent thought. He was yelling about globalism and how the Chinese were trying to take over the world. He mumbled a string of words I couldn't make out, then shouted clear as day, "Ping Ling," followed by another string of unintelligible stuff, and finally SCREWIN our daughters. As the last word left his lips, he immediately fell to the floor and began to sob. I had no idea what to do. If I tried to help him, I knew he would get violent toward me. In the end, I did nothing. I just went to my room. A few weeks after that particularly lovely incident, Steve and I got into an argument about something that I can't remember. He stormed off to his room, and I thought it was over. I knew from experience that given time and distance he would calm down. He would never apologize, but at least the situation would de-escalate. I was wrong this time, and 10 minutes later, he came crashing back into the living room, gun in hand, and pointed it in my face. He was yelling that if I wasn't going to respect him, then he might as well just kill me. "You're not going to shoot me," I said far more calmly than I felt. Inside, I was pooping my pants, despite the fact that I did honestly believe he wouldn't shoot me. I had been around guns before, but never had I had one pointed at me. "Yeah," he said. "Why do you think that?" "I know it," I replied. "I know you're not going to shoot me because I'm one of the few real friends you have left." He seemed to consider this for a moment and finally lowered the gun. His face was still murder incarnate, but at least the gun wasn't pointed at me. "Can you move, man?" I asked. "I'm trying to watch Netflix." He continued to stare at me for a long while, seeming to be internally fighting with himself, before finally stopping back to his room. I didn't see him again for the rest of the night. A few days later, Steve and Greg asked me to sit down when I came home from my 3rd double in a row at the restaurant where I worked. I asked why, and they said we needed to talk about me living there. I told them there was no need. I was moving out. They seemed satisfied with this, and I went to my room to get some much needed sleep. As a side note, as I was moving out, I accidentally broke the handle off of the storm door, and Steve lost his mind, screaming at me and calling all kinds of names, including racial slurs. I assured him that I would replace it, but he just kept calling me names. Nick was helping me move out at the time, and once we were away from the house, he gave me a look that spoke volumes. "I know," I said. "I know. Part of the reason I'm moving out." I didn't say anything. He replied, "You didn't have to," I said. This was the point that I finally snapped and realized that Steve was nothing but a toxic piece of crap. It took someone I hadn't known for very long giving me a single look for that puzzle piece to finally finally fall into place and make me go, screw this guy. After I moved out, I only saw Steve once more. I was coming out of class on the university campus and he drove up on his motorcycle and started trying to make conversation, but I just made some lame excuse about needing to get to work or home or something and walked away. About a year later, I blocked Steve completely on all social media when he commented on a Facebook post and called my mom a name. I don't know why I didn't do it sooner. About a year after that, Nick and I were at the mall. Being on a bit of a time crunch and needing things from different stores, we decided to head different directions and meet up in the food court. I finished what I needed to do first and was standing in front of the Dairy Queen waiting for Nick to meet me when I got a phone call from him. "What's up?" I said by way of answering. "I just saw Steve," he said without preamble. He was going into the store I was coming out of. He didn't need to tell me which Steve. He knew most of the worst of what I've put in this story by this point, although I'm sure some of these anecdotes would surprise even him. My heart seemed to seize and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I hadn't seen or spoken to Steve in over 2 years, and the thought of coming face to face with him now filled me with dread. "Hello, you there?" "Yeah," I said, finally finding my voice. "I'll meet you at the car. That's why I told you. I'll be out in a bit." I practically sprinted to the car and just kept praying to whatever gods might exist that Nick would be out soon. I went over and over in my mind what I would say or do if Steve showed up. Luckily, I never had to find out what I would have actually done or said because Nick appeared pretty quick and we left. That was the last I heard of Steve. The incidents that are portrayed in this story are not everything that happened over the course of my relationship with Steve. There were more, including more death threats, a physical altercation, more name calling, and insurance fraud that Steve decided to rope me into without my knowledge. These were just the worst or more poignant incidents that needed to be told in order to paint Steve as he truly exists. Were I to tell the entire story of Steve, it would likely wind up being a whole novel. A lot of it, while terrible, isn't really all that relevant in the grand scheme of things. So there's the Ballad of Steve. Now, I know at this point you're wondering to yourself why I didn't just leave Steve in the dust a long time ago. Why didn't I just walk away from that friendship at the first sign of trouble? Well, there are a few reasons. First and foremost, as I said, Steve was a sociopath. Sociopaths are extremely versed in making people trust them, even as they treat them like trash. Not to mention he gaslit me and made me feel as though a lot of the smaller incidents were my fault. That in turn led to me believing the bigger problems were my fault. This is how psychological abusers keep control. Secondly, I am a loyal friend to a fault. I will see the best in the people I care about even as they stab me in the back and beat me down. This is a fault of mine that I am working on. I only saw the terrible in Steve when he treated another friend I was loyal to bad. Third, a part of me was terrified to walk away. There was a piece of me that was scared, and sometimes still is since I blocked him, that he would get it in his head to kill me because I rejected him. This is again part of the conditioning that abusers do. Regardless, I am much happier now and glad that the whole ordeal is behind me. I'd like to end on this final note. If you are in a relationship of any kind where you are starting to see red flags, don't ignore them like I did. I explained away a lot of the red flags that Steve was waving proudly, and I regret it to this day. I was lucky and got out of the most toxic friendship I've ever known with only some psychological trauma and having my confidence shattered. But it could have ended so much worse. If you need help getting out, seek it immediately. Leave everything behind if you have to. Things can be replaced. You can't. Anyway, thanks for reading this, and Steve, please stay wherever you move to. I don't ever want to see or hear from you again. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. I live in a quiet countryside where usually nothing is happening. I'm an 18-year-old girl who could easily walk around my hometown alone without even being scared because it's really safe here. Basically no crimes. So, as usual, me and my dog went for a walk one evening. It was nice weather outside, so I decided to go for a nearby field. I usually let my dog out of her leash there, so it was fun for both of us. She's a nice dog and always comes when I call for her. We get to the field and everything is going really well and nothing seems off, except I have this kind of odd feeling in my gut that I never usually have. The last time I had the same feeling when I was 8 years old and we were driving at night with my family. I had the same feeling then and I told it to my parents. I feel like something is wrong. You should be careful. I said something like that. They slowed down because I was oddly serious at the moment. A minute after I said it, a deer came out of nowhere and we would have crushed if we had gone by the same speed as a minute before. We were all shocked and my mom thanked me. I still remember it like it was yesterday. However, in the field, 10 years later, I get the same gut feeling. Whatever I think can keep going completely completely ignoring it. We roll around the fields in a nearby forest until the sunset starts to set. I put my dog back to her leash and decide to leave from one of the tiny paths that go through a small forest. It's not a popular way to go, but it's quick. As I'm walking along that path, I suddenly spot a silhouette in the end of the road just before the forest starts. I think nothing of it at that point and just keep walking, but after just a little while I have a strong gut feeling and stare at the silhouette for a while. It's then that I notice that the silhouette is staring at me without moving. I just think that maybe they were waiting for someone, because at first the silhouette looked like a child's. But as I got closer, I noticed that it wasn't a child but a grown man who was riding what looked like a child's bicycle. It was a blue-green boy's bicycle. His legs were way too long for it and his whole body looked like he was forcing himself to ride it. It was a really unsettling sight. Still, my dumb self didn't want to turn around and have a couple of kilometers waste of time, and even though it was creepy looking, I still thought maybe he's waiting for someone that comes from my way. But every step I take, he follows me with intense expression. I'm only like a 20 meters away from him when he starts to do a weird motion by jumping on his bike, smiling the ugliest and the most unsettling smile I've ever seen, just staring at me with wide eyes. He kinda looks like he was expecting something and is so excited about it that he needs to jump. He looks like he's in his 50s or something, very long and thin legs and arms, bald, and that creepy unsettling smile. That's when my alarm rings went on. I glanced behind me and no one was there. It was just me, a 18-year-old small girl with her fluffy, definitely not a guard, dog. I turn around 360 and start to jog where I came from, just in case. I glanced at him in sigh of relief when I noticed he wasn't following me or anything. I thought that maybe he wasn't waiting for me after all, and called myself stupid and a scaredy cat. I was so wrong. My adrenaline starts to slow down again as I'm in the middle of the fields and I still see no sign of him following me. I let my dog out of her leash again and she starts to run around. I'm nearly at the end of the field. I only have a kilometer or some of forest part before I get to my home after the field part. When my dog spots a rabbit or deer or some interesting thing and flies towards it, I panic because she has never done that before and yell for her. I yell plenty of times for her loudly and finally she comes back. I'm relieved that nothing happened to her, but as I put her back to her leash, I notice something form the corner of my eye. The freaking bald long legs is biking towards me. He's not looking at the ground when he bikes, but me. Freak out wasn't enough to express my feeling in that moment. I have never seen a human who looked so crazy. More than crazy. What surprised me the most was that he was biking through a field, and I can tell you it is not an easy field to even walk sometimes. It has muddy ponds that you need to jump over, but that psychopath just biked through them. He was struggling a lot to bike there, but somehow managed to still do that. I didn't watch for another second behind me because I just started running. I ran so freaking full speed, and I have asthma that I saw black and nearly collapsed. My lungs hurt so bad that I thought I was dying, but the adrenaline kept my blood running, and my legs too. Once I glanced behind me and he was there, struggling badly to keep up his full speed on the field grounds with that ugly white smile, and the way too little bike. After that I just ran like crazy until I found a house, hid in their yard without even minding that I was in someone else's yard. It didn't matter to me in that moment at all. I waited a while with my breathing stuck in my throat, but he didn't come. I was planning to yell as loudly as I could if he found me, but he never did. At some point the adrenaline started leaving my system and I left my hiding spot. I ran again until I reached an area which had multiple people in their yards, so I would have helped if I saw him again. But I didn't. I called the cops on my phone but couldn't bring myself to call, mostly because I had no proof and I didn't want my parents to find out because they are overprotecting, so I wouldn't probably leave my house anymore. I still live with them. Side note. I've been paranoid after this incident. My dog was frightened too. I guess she noticed something was really off too. I swear to God that I will always listen to my gut when it's telling me something from now on. A couple of years ago at university, a 20-year-old woman, decided to join a project group that catered to a niche interest. The group met on Thursday evening, so I went along for the first time, excited to join. I had a pretty good time and met some nice people. There was one guy sitting near me who didn't say very much but kept staring at me while we were working on our project. I didn't think much of it, assuming he was just awkward around girls or something, so I tried to be friendly and speak to him the same as I was speaking to the other people in our project group. He still didn't really say anything to me, he'd just look at me. But he was working hard on the project, so again I didn't think much of it aside from that you get all kinds of people in the world. At the end of the meet, I said goodbye to the group I'd been working with and agreed to see them at the next meetup. I said goodbye to the strange guy as well since he was standing near me silently with everyone else. Feeling good about the project, I turned away and left the building to walk home. But as I walked away from the group, I noticed the strange guy immediately peeled away from the group and was walking right behind me. I turned and tried to be super friendly by saying, "Oh, I'll be walking down that road, so I'll say goodbye now and see you next time. He said nothing and kept walking behind me. I was getting slightly creeped out, but at this stage I was mostly annoyed because I wanted to walk alone listening to music. I had a long walk home and didn't feel like a pained interaction with this strange awkward guy. Anyway, after quite a while of saying nothing, he was still walking with me, but he was now next to me, still completely silent. I was starting to get majorly creeped out, but I still tried to reason with myself that he's just an awkward dude who happens to live in the same direction as me. We were walking towards a common student area, so I decided I'd keep walking until I got to a grocery store not far from home. I also considered that should he have bad intentions, I wanted to stay friendly to him so as not to anger him. He continues walking with me in silence, and by the time we reach the grocery store, it's been about 20 minutes. I'm thinking I just need to get rid of him by going in here, as he'll just continue onto his house, right? Nope. I say, well, I've got to get loads of shopping done, so I'll say goodbye and I go into the store. I see him hesitate at the door, but he says nothing. I go in the store and glance back, and he's still outside the store, but thank God he didn't come in with me. So I run around the aisles for a bit to waste time, and then I see him crossing the end of one aisle inside the store. I grabbed something random off the shelf to take to the cashier, having some vague plan of telling them what was happening. But being naive, I was still worried about reading the situation all wrong and getting a poor awkward guy in trouble for nothing, so I didn't say anything. While paying, the guy saw me and waited for me at the exit. I walked past him and this time said nothing at all. I decided to just go straight home, since I lived with male roommates who I thought would be able to help me, and it was the first thing I thought of to do. Probably very stupid to reveal where I lived, but I was freaked out and not thinking. I didn't want to use my phone to call anyone as I was worried it would just make the guy angry to hear me saying I was scared of him. So he continued walking next to me and we power walked to my house. At this point I realized with shock that none of my roommates would be home at this time, so I was actually alone. The guy was still silent and he actually followed behind me as I walked up the path to my front door. I repeat the next part over and over in my mind for all the things that could have gone wrong and all the possibilities of what could have happened. I decided I had to just get inside and lock the door at any cost, so I thought the best thing to do was shock him. I got my keys ready in my hand and turned them in the lock. Then I turned around and flung my arms around his neck saying thank you so much for walking me home. It was so nice to meet you, and just be really loud and friendly and hugging. It did shock him, and in the next second I removed myself from him, turned, slipped through the door and slammed it shut. He didn't have time to react and I got in safely. After going upstairs, I looked through the window and saw him go back out to the road and just stand there for a bit. Then he just walked off back up the road. Goes without saying, I never went back to the project group and it made me extremely anxious about letting anyone know where I lived. I looked out for the guy constantly but never saw him again in my road, so for whatever reason he didn't come back. Don't know what his intentions were, but it was just bizarre. It made me very vigilant, and overnight I went from naive and friendly to suspicious and private. At the time of this story, I was 14. I'm a dude. This takes place during the winter. I enjoy taking night walks. I never go out too late, but I go out when it's still dark. I usually do this because in the area I live in, my primary school friends lived in the same area and I wanted to avoid them at all costs. I also just enjoyed the nighttime because I found it peaceful. One day, I decided to go out later. I had just come home from somewhere at around 8 at night, so I told my parents I was heading out for a walk. They were hesitant to let me go, as I usually went at around 6 in the afternoon, but eventually they let me as long as I had my phone on me, so I headed out. I usually dress in all black with a hood on and a face mask, and I walk with my hands in my pockets. Bonus points if I have gloves on. Usually people who pass me on the street avoid me because of the all black attire I wear. Anyways, after roughly half an hour I had almost completed my walk, so close that I could see my house from where I was at. That's when I saw a light. It was a bright white light, moving randomly but generally staying in the same spot. I have pretty bad eyesight and it was dark, so as I walked I squinted to try and see what it was. Turns out, it was a dude also wearing all black, but with a headlamp. I walked closer, but slowed down my pace significantly. I got a really uneasy feeling, and I didn't like him at all. I wanted to just get home, but I would have had to walk past him in order to get to my house. I thought about turning around, but I really didn't want to walk the 30 minutes all the way back, as it would probably be 9 at night by then, and I didn't want to worry my parents. I continued to walk very slowly, watching him carefully. Suddenly, he stopped moving. Then he turned around and stopped again. The light was still. My heart dropped. There was a grassy area right next to the road that I was walking on, so I moved to the grassy area and began slowly walking there instead. I was pretty far from him still, so I thought to myself, if this guy runs towards you, run faster. It was a tense couple of seconds before he began jogging, not moving directly towards me but still coming in my general direction. I didn't run quite yet, as he certainly could have just been a jogger running along the road. I thought that until his jog broke into a run, and this time it was straight for me. I inhaled sharply quickly and booked it in the opposite direction. I had always been quite a fast runner, and my legs were quite strong because I would go on a lot of bike rides in my area, which has a lot of steep hills. I was able to run for a solid 10 minutes, not daring to look behind me. I made it up a large hill before stopping to catch my breath. I looked to see if he was chasing me, but the only thing I could see of him was that light. It was moving around the same way I had seen before, and it was shining directly into my eyes. I jogged the rest of the way home. My mom saw that I was sweaty and exhausted, but I just told her I had gone for a run this time instead, which wasn't far from the truth. My boyfriend bought a house in a super stereotypical white suburban neighborhood. Living there was super awkward at first because I'm a person of color, and while the neighbors were friendly, they often would make backhanded remarks or comments. Because of this, I tried to avoid socializing with people as much as possible. A few months after moving in, I noticed there was a house a few doors down that never had lights on or cars pulling in and out of the driveway. But the trash was always put out at the end of the driveway on trash day. I started paying more attention to the house after noticing this. I started noticing odd things about the house, like noticing flickery but super dim lights from certain windows and blinds sometimes closing and opening. Anyways, one day I was walking the dog and I passed the house. A man was in the front yard observing the landscaping, and he waved at me and said hello and introduced himself as the neighbor who lives in the house. As he approached me, I noticed that he smelled really terrible, like poop and mildew, which was really odd because he seemed well dressed and well groomed. The way he smiled also made me feel uneasy. He was always smiley with his teeth, and his eyes had a deadness to them. I told him I was wondering if anyone lived in the house because for the most part it seemed abandoned. He just shrugged, but he seemed to be in a hurry to end the conversation after I brought this up, which was fine with me. As I walked away from the house, I kept turning around to make sure he wasn't following me, and I kept getting the chills. A few days after meeting him, I was on another walk with the dog, and I noticed that the front door to the house was open. I thought this was odd because it would be letting all the heat into the house, and it was the middle of summer. The next day, the door was still open, so I called the police to do a wellness check. Once the police arrived, I watched from my house to see if I could see anything going on. The police officers didn't step foot in the house, and about half an hour later a fire engine showed up. The police officer and the fighters stayed talking outside for a while after the firemen had entered and exited the house, but not much else happened. About a month later, my boyfriend was walking the dog and he stopped to talk to some women who were clearing things out of the house. They told him that the house belonged to their father, who was currently in an inpatient dementia treatment, and that the house had been inhabited by a squatter. They told him that house was full of mold on the wall that was almost an inch thick, and that the man had been hoarding roadkill in one of rooms. It also showed signs of him living in the house, including a space cleared out for him on an old moldy mattress in the upstairs bedroom. They had found candles and a salt circle in one room, as well as notebooks full of writings about the devil and devoting yourself to Satan and other worldly alien beings. I guess on the end the squatter had just decided to up and leave the house alone. The women have since cleared out the house and it has been gutted and remodeled. I'm not sure if they are selling it or what's the plan with it, but the memory of that man and his empty smile and the smell coming off of him will stay with me forever. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. In 2016, I was 26. I worked a seasonal job at a warehouse about a 30-minute drive from my flat. One day after work, I ordered some takeout from a place maybe 10 blocks from home. There was a gas station next door, so I filled up and left my car at the pump to say hello to some friends who lived across the street while I waited for my food to be ready. Maybe 15 minutes of chatting, walking back across the street, grabbing my food, across the lot to the gas station, into my car, and a 2-minute drive to my flat. At the time, I lived in a duplex flat with a gutted adjacent flat attached. Behind me was an old vacant motel that was currently being gutted and repurposed into studio apartments. The nearest building to the left was an old clapper bar leading to the main street and the highway, and to the right was an empty lot where a building that was demolished nearly a decade earlier once stood. The rest of the neighborhood was lower income Hispanic. I pulled into my drive, noticed a car driving relatively slow past. I went inside and leashed my dog up to let her out. As I was standing in the yard waiting for the dog to do her business, a maroon Subaru Forester, newer at the time, drove by slowly multiple times before pulling into my drive. I assumed he was lost or looking for something and walked up to him as he got out of the car and approached me. He looked like any older white man in his 50s. I remember he kind of reminded me of my dad. I asked him if he needed anything, and he replied, "No, I just was checking on you." I asked him if I knew him, figuring maybe I didn't recognize him. He replied, "I saw you up by the gas station. You seemed like you needed help. I've just said if you need anything." I'm usually pretty slow to the cut, but at this point, I'd paced together together that this man had followed me from the gas station to a friend's house to a restaurant and then home, and immediately didn't sit right. He was just standing there and he wasn't leaving, and I had time to process the situation. I thought maybe he's an older guy, I'm a younger girl, he's on this side of town in a nice car for whatever reason. Maybe he thinks I'm a trick. And I said again, I'm sorry, I'm not picking up what you're putting down. Why are you here? Nothing, I'm just a nice guy checking to see if you're alright. I specifically remember him calling himself a nice guy. During the period of this conversation, I had made it to my stoop and he had closed the gap. Behind was door, then me, the dog, then him and his car. I told him you should leave, to which he asked, do you wish you had a nicer place? And if my dog, a medium-sized German Shepherd, was friendly and reached out toward her for a pet. I yanked her behind me and said no and pretty aggressively told him, dude, leave. He finally started backing away. I stood in the drive until he got in his car and drove off. I took down his license plate and car description, then I went inside. 15 minutes later, he pulled back into my drive, sat there for a second, and drove off. That's when I decided to file a police report. It didn't sit right. I just figured it was nothing, but I lived alone and if anything happened, I'd want a record. It was 6 or 7 at this point, so the non-emergency line was closed. I filled out a report online and never heard back from the police. Never saw that man or his maroon Forester again either. He might have just been a weird old man. I never saw any reports of anyone going missing from Nevada in 2016 either. I know it's a stretch and probably has nothing to do with anything, but I'd only just thought of this again in the last few months. They caught that guy in New York, and I wondered if he was in Nevada before it ever came out. Same age, same build, but how do you remember a face from 7 years ago? I just remember the man at my place having more salt and pepper hair. He treated me like he thought I was soliciting, and he wanted to help. He did not respect my boundaries. It was probably nothing and not the same man. Scary, off situations just have a way of sticking with you. Maybe trying to connect this is my way of making it make sense. I used to hang out with my cousin a lot. We were both 10-year-old boys at the time of this encounter and I'm now 33 years old. It has stayed with me ever since. We'd mostly spend our youth roaming the streets, not causing trouble, but kicking footballs around fields, climbing, hanging out with kids our age, the typical stuff before phones and Netflix became commonplace. One day we decided to go and explore a part of town that we'd never explored before. It meant going through alleyways and back streets. The trail would actually end approximately 2 to 3 minutes from my house, which was a safe part of the neighborhood. It was a sunny day, albeit not too warm, and my cousin and I had been walking for what seemed like miles. The journey we planned was supposed to go on for longer, but we got bored and decided to take a detour home. The detour involved cutting through an alleyway that looked a little bit like the Coronation Street General, if anyone is familiar with the television show. To the left of us were terraced houses, and to the right of us, steel fences with sharp points to deter any would-be thieves. We continued up here, and soon enough, one of the kids from our school lived there, and his mom shouted, "What are you boys doing here?" We ran, and I don't know why, we just didn't like her son and her tone was accusatory. As we ran, we bumped into another kid. "Don't go that way," he said, as his voice trailed off as he ran farther and farther away from us, down the opposite end of the alleyway. We shrugged and continued on. It got darker with the trees and foliage, but we soon emerged from the alley, and that's where we saw the lone boy. A boy aged 10 or 12 stood there. His eyes were empty. He had a vacant look on his face. Well, the half of his face that we could see well enough. Above his mouth was covered with a veil, somewhat like a Halloween mask of some description, except it was June. Halloween was months away. As we got closer, we noticed the boy had a kitchen knife in his hands. I mean a fully real, stainless steel kitchen knife, both hands on the handle. The sunlight made the blade glisten. We cracked a joke, cooking outside, but he looked at us blankly, no emotion, nothing. We were too freaked out to move, and that's when we realized he hadn't moved either. Not a muscle. We saw him blink, but physically, the knife hadn't been raised up or pointed at us, just held closely to his chest, blade pointing upwards. We figured we should get away because instinct told us this was weird and a bit freaky. Going back down the alley didn't seem like a safe option. Being stuck in an alleyway with a strange kid with a knife didn't seem smart. In front of us was a road on a steep hill. It was our best bet. We walked up to the top of the hill, keeping an eye on the kid. The top of the hill was 2 to 3 minutes from my house in terms of distance. At last, we felt safe. As we looked back down the hill, the lone kid had put the knife by his leg, now holding it in one hand, but remained in the exact same spot, and stared right back up at us, expressionless. We told our parents what had happened and they called a local community enforcement team to scout the area. Apparently the kid was found with the knife, but we never heard why he was there or what he was doing. 23 years after it happened, it's still on my mind. While I was living and studying in the capital of my country, I had a small rented basement of a 1917 built house next to a nightclub. I was preparing to go to sleep quite early since I had class at 8 in the morning the next day. Right before I fell asleep, I remembered that I forgot to lock the door, but since the city I lived in was generally quite safe, and the only way to get to the entrance of my place was past a front gate, all around to the other side of the house and down some stairs, I didn't think much of it and proceeded to fall asleep. Skip forward to the middle of the night, I wake up and feel someone or something slowly pulling my blanket off me. In a confused state, I extend my hand and feel a hairy, male arm under my fingers. My first thought was, oh, this is probably my drunk flatmate, but then I remembered that he is at his girlfriend's place on the other side of town. In pitch black, I jump from my bed, rush to the light switch, and as I turn it on, I find a stranger around my age, a student, standing in his underwear by my bed, with his underwear clearly wet. My initial reaction was to stay calm, since I had no idea if this dude was violent or what was even going on in the first place. I calmly asked him, man, what are you doing here? He was clearly very confused as well and took a sit on a recliner I had in my tiny room. And there we are, both in our underwear, him covered in something wet and I on the border of pissing myself, and what does he do? He extends his hand and introduces himself to me. At that point I go, okay dude, get out of my house, and start escorting him to the hallway where I find all his clothes and shoes on the floor. As I am escorting him out, he goes into the bathroom and locks himself inside. I hear him turn on the shower and proceed to knock on the door saying, hey man, if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the cops, to which he replies, I'm not afraid of the police. Well, that's just perfect, isn't it? A few minutes pass and he steps out of the bathroom butt naked, with my flatmate's towel around his waist, looks at me looking kind of content, and says, hey, did you see? They've got a shower here. At that point I am fuming. Who's got a shower? This is my house. You're a total stranger and you broke into my place. Suddenly an expression of complete fear appears on his face. Oh my god, what have I done? Jesus Christ, he starts exclaiming as he is very awkwardly trying to get dressed in the hallway. Then I managed to get him out of the house. I even called one of his friends from my phone to come pick him up at the club. Turns out he's from a completely other town and came to party to the capital, got kicked out of the club for starting a fight, and somehow managed to get into my place. To this day I have no idea what he was on or how he managed to find my apartment, as it is quite hidden from the street. Let's just say I never forgot to lock the door from that day. When I was 21, I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment with my 15-year-old sister and our mom. How we ended up there is another story in itself. The complex was in the same town I grew up in. It wasn't the best complex around, but it also wasn't the worst. I took comfort in the fact that we would see the security guards roaming quite often because the laundry units were in every other building, and of course, our building didn't have a unit, so I felt safer knowing there were guards around when I did my laundry late at night. I was on the top floor, so I'd have to drag my laundry down 5 flights of stairs, walk outside to the neighboring building, and go to the lower level to do laundry. One day I noticed a new security guard. He was a large man and probably about 6'3", very muscular build. He wasn't as friendly as other guards. He didn't really acknowledge residents, so he was a little scary and intimidating, but that's good for the job he had. My friend lived in the same complex in a building behind me. There was a little playground and tennis court that separated front buildings from back buildings. One day my friend texted me around 10 at night saying she went to do her laundry and she saw him lurking around the building she needed to go into. The guards were only supposed to survey the grounds outside and only go inside a building for suspicious activity. They only had keys to the building front doors but didn't have keys for laundry units. At least that's what we were told. He ended up following her into the laundry room where she verbally assaulted him and threatened to call management if he didn't get out. She said he stood still just glaring at her and left the building without saying a word. Now that this was fresh in my mind, I was on high alert. A few weeks go by and I come home after work around 9:30. When I pulled into my lot, I noticed the power was out. The whole parking lot and all the buildings are pitch black, no light sources detected anywhere. I decided to back my car into a spot so I could have a clear view of my building from my car. I was a little hesitant to get out because I had some bags of hair product I bought from work, some food I picked up, my water bottle, and my purse to carry, and I knew it would take some time to gather my stuff and lock up my car. We also had some homeless people nearby that would dig through the dumpster bins and search the lot for cigarette butts that were still smokable. One man in particular seemed very strung out and unpredictable, so I didn't want to have a run-in when I could barely see anything. I called my mom to come down and open the door for me, but she didn't answer. My sister never answers her phone, so I didn't even bother trying. I sat in the car contemplating my next move. By then my eyes had somewhat adjusted to the darkness and I decided to stop being such a chicken and just go inside. As I gathered up my things, the power suddenly came back on and I felt so relieved. but when I looked into the windows of my building, that relief quickly turned to fear and suspicion. I saw that same security guard that followed my friend standing on our top floor landing and staring at our door. There were 3 other doors on my floor and he was standing in front of ours. He didn't move for a few seconds and just stared at our door with his head leaned forward like he was trying to listen through our door. He then slowly turned and made his way downstairs. I called my mom again and she answered this time. I told her what I saw and she came down to get me and then called building management. I never saw him again. I don't know what happened, if he quit or got fired, but I was very relieved that we wouldn't have to deal with his strange behavior anymore. Apparently other residents had strange encounters with him as well. It's scary when you can't even feel safe in your own home. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. Some context, I, a 24-year-old woman, live in a basement suite with my fiance, who is 26 years old. We live below a man and his young daughter. We're pretty friendly and look out for one another, but aren't exactly close. It's a normal detached home, just divided. We have no windows facing the backyard, just to the left and right of the house. Please note that while we live in the same house, we have had no issues other than hearing what is happening upstairs. I am also an extremely deep sleeper. Behind our backyard is a ravine, basically a tiny creek, but it's incredibly steep on either side, covered in bushes, trees, and other vegetation. It's not exactly easy to walk around in. We have a short, maybe 4-foot tall, chain link fence dividing our property from the creek. One house down there is a little path that leads down the creek and connects to an adjacent field and playground. It's maintained. There are no other paths off of the main one. It is just prickly bushes and steep, tough terrain. So now onto the story. About 3 months ago, my fiance woke me up terrified because she had heard banging outside and there were flashlights shining into our ground level windows. I instantly called 911, who promptly told me the cops were already there and probably the ones with flashlights. Annoyed, I pulled on some pants and headed outside to see what was happening. I was informed by the police the man above me had called because he stated people were on his property harassing him. They asked if we know of any ongoing mental health issues on his side, which makes me question if anything actually happened, but my fiance did hear some weird stuff before the cops showed up. All the while, I'm watching my neighbor plead with the police to check the creek out back because he swears he saw them go out that way. They briefly shine their flashlights back there and leave, determining nothing is actually going on. I get the lowdown the next day. Apparently he heard people banging on his back door, throwing gravel at his windows, and watched his front door handle turn. Man was freaked out, terrified for his daughter, and had no clue who it could be. He spends the next week barely sleeping, sitting by the back door with a baseball bat. Nothing happens, we all relax. It happens again a week later, as soon as he chills out. Same deal, fiance wakes me up, less scared because we know what's going on, but nevertheless the cops find nothing and upstairs man is freaked again. This time he installs cameras. They are on the inside of his house, pointed out the windows. They are rather small and hard to notice, and there's no way you could see them at night. This seems to do the trick. We no longer are dealing with the cops or the banging from whoever is harassing our neighbor. However, after about a month I get chatting in the yard with the neighbor and he tells me almost every single night someone has been in the creek shining a light into his windows. His bedroom specifically. Laser pointers, flashlights, you name it. It's coming from the creek. I'm a little freaked but tell myself he's overly paranoid. Could be some lights from the other side or whatever. This keeps going on. He consistently is complaining about these lights. Concerned someone is still screwy with him. And with being in the same house, last week I said screw it and bought the best outdoor camera I could afford with all the fancy night vision features. Doesn't hurt to have security cameras anyways, right? It should be arriving soon. In the meantime, I'm thinking of some way to keep someone out of the creek. Still slightly doubtful anyone could get back there without hopping our fence. I walk down the path open to public use, stop where the property fence lines start, push past a prickly bush that tries to take me out, and come across a well-worn path with footprints and broken branches, flattened bushes that have clearly been walked on repeatedly. Creeped out, I push on to see where this path goes, and it ends right at our property, right where my neighbor says the lights come from. There is nowhere else to go. The path is right next to where it drops off into the creek. I couldn't go further as it's all thick brush. It just ends at our house. Someone, for weeks, has been sitting in the woods behind our house tormenting my upstairs neighbor for no apparent reason. I am unbelievably creeped out. How do they know what bedroom he's in? How did they know when the cameras went up? Why do they never bother us? He swears up and down he doesn't have any enemies. His ex is the mother of his daughter. They share custody and she wouldn't scare her like that. I'm as baffled as I am horrified. This happened in an empty coffee shop parking lot. I was using their Wi-Fi to download movies. I thought I knew what a narcissist was up until 2 days ago. I studied it, remembered the traits. I thought I knew about 4 of them, including my parents. Trust me, there's a whole nother level of it, and it'd be scary to witness if you weren't very secure in yourself, and experiencing it firsthand is a mind game. If you even think a person could not have narcissism, then they probably don't. I was able to extremely clearly detect it, and somewhat to a degree of absolute certainty. I'm glad I had this encounter because what I had previously thought about certain people was in fact completely wrong judgment. I'm sitting at a coffee shop at 6 in the morning downloading movies on their Wi-Fi. A guy in a truck parks and comes up to my car's slightly open window and asks about the price of the local homes. He's probably about 35 to 40 years old, wearing nice clothes, charming, doesn't stutter or sound stupid. I think this guy is normal, asking a pretty basic question. I'm as passive as I can be. He doesn't seem to want to leave. He's just standing there in an awkward silence after I tell him 320,000 to 500,000. He asks me who's the best builder. I'm thinking, do I look like a realtor? I tell him I don't know. He then says, you have a good long weekend, thanks. Then stuff got pretty weird and it got worse and worse. He goes into the coffee shop for 45 minutes. I'm already thinking to myself that this is somewhat odd. He's probably talking to the teenage employees. There's nobody else in there. He comes out, walks back up to my window and gives me this odd look of disappointment and says, okay, you have a nice long weekend, as if we needed to catch up from his 45-minute absence, like we weren't done talking. He then talks to someone walking by in front of my car. They know each other from years past. The person asking him, so you're back in town. I'm thinking to myself, oh wow, maybe this guy isn't the creepiest guy I've ever met. Guy he used to know leaves. He throws on his Beats headphones, walks to the tailgate of his truck, arms crossed over the back of it, resting his head in his arms, staring at me for at least 5 minutes from about 30 feet away. I glance at him every minute to see if he's still staring at me. I'm like, man, this guy's creepy. I should probably leave, but my movies weren't finished. I'm not one to be afraid of other people, so I stay. I have a combat switchblade in my door for reasons like this. I felt pretty safe because I'm me, but felt like this guy was trying to intimidate me with every lie that came out of his mouth. Inconsistencies galore. He's walking back up to my car. I'm like, what does this guy want now? We talked for 30 minutes. Or well, he did most of the talking. Within 15 minutes, this is what I learned about him without saying more than a few things like, oh, he's looking to buy a house, but he already owns 4. He has a restraining order, can't go within 100 feet of where I suggested he looked for a home. He is on the dangerous persons list, nearly yelling at me to Google it because I'm like, oh okay, whatever, father is rich because he is era, and is a retired cop. I don't believe him, not that I said anything. He reacted to my facial expression alone. He then opens his bank account on his phone and shows me $3,000. He tells me the police pay him $4,500 a month. It says $1,000 a month. I tell him it looks like they shorted you for the past 3 payments. He quickly takes the phone away, looks insulted. He says, you see that? Canadian Provincial Police. It also stands for Canadian Pension Plan, which this guy is clearly too unstable to hold a job of any kind whatsoever. He claims he was in secret operations with police, can't say what he did at all. Tells me he was with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and what kind of training they gave him at age 18, solitude in a box for 8 weeks, using the bathroom in a cup, is the main enforcer for the local notorious biker gang. This spouting off random names like I'm supposed to know them, like I care to begin with, informs me that people are afraid of him. He then asks if I'm afraid of him. This gave me a good laugh. He looked at me like he was totally insulted. People then arrived to get coffee. He states looks like the cowards are coming out of the woodwork. He then informs me that he's watching out for police, states that he is untouchable, the biker gangs have his back, then says so do the police because they don't care, which I'm not sure how that makes sense. I decided to ask if he has a family, hinting that maybe he should go be with them instead of pestering me. He apparently has 4 kids who are each hockey champions under age 16. They were trained by none other than the Toronto Maple Leafs coach. He made sure to whip his phone out to prove this, that in his contacts is someone named Blue. He makes it crystal clear who the people are to make sure I understand. I let him talk and talk until I say, well, I don't follow hockey. He realizes he's just wasted his valuable time, like 5 minutes straight explaining who the 3 hockey coaches were in order of skill, and he's pretty disappointed that I don't follow hockey. He asks me what I do. I tell him some lies saying I'm a transcriber, make $15 per hour, company name is Lion Bridge to hint that I know he's completely full of it. He types this company name into his phone saying that's good information conversation to have. Like, even though he's rich and everything he needs to make $15 an hour, he asks me if I know where the best houses are in a suburb of extremely similar looking $500,000 houses. I ask if he has a realtor. He says no, I don't need one. I humor him, you want to pay in cash, don't you? Apparently everything he does is off the books, except like, you know, the pension plan of $1,000 per month. He then starts talking about a black guy violating a young girl. This is so random, I don't know what to say. I become quiet. Palms are sweaty. I'm thinking to myself something like psychopath alert. I can't even use my phone, my fingers are so wet. I'm just vaping away, blowing vapor out the window at him. He's not taking the hit. The senior-aged man walks past him towards a dumpster. He says to his face, "Look at this chump." The old man is wide-eyed like he doesn't know what is happening, and neither do I. Old man looks at me and gives me this look of confirmation that he has completely sized up the situation that I'm in and is also thinking what is going on. The guy that informs me that he owns the town starts spouting random names again, then informs me there's a serial killer living down the street. Tells me he isn't leaving until 7:30 in the morning to not be rude to me. I'm so confused by this I just stop talking. A silent minute passes. He tells me I should leave because it's going to get loud soon. I'm now considering that this guy is here to shoot or bomb someone, possibly me. I grab my blade but leave it closed and soaking in my left hand. I ask why should I leave? He says there's a storm coming. I tell him I'm not afraid of thunder. He looks insulted. He's been speaking in covert wording this entire time, so to get a better feel for this guy I ask where he's from and if he slept in his truck last night. He looks offended like I'm the one who is off his rocker, but he doesn't say anything other than no. Another silent minute passes. He then looks at me, changes his facial expression to angry, says very calmly that if he were me he'd get out of town right now. Is he warning me or threatening me? I honestly can't tell. It takes me a few seconds to even process what he's just said. I'm not intimidated in the least, or amused. I humor him, why's that? He starts laughing his head off, walking away now and asks was that scary? I laugh and tell him an assured no, shaking my head at the absurdity of him. He's now halfway to his truck. Finally, now he's walking back to me. I flick my blade open and casually flip it in the air to invert it blade down. He fist bumps me and says you're a good guy, laughing, then walks away. He roars away in his truck, windows down, music blaring at 7:30 in the morning. I was just glad that he was gone. I just sat there perplexed at this character, wondering how many mental disorder boxes he'd check off. It wasn't even a question. This guy was trying to intimidate me in any way possible and was trying to prove his worth to me in any way possible, reacting to each of my facial expressions so quickly and in such a way that made me feel like he was sizing me up the entire time. Just glad he eventually left. I'm on holiday with my boyfriend and our dog in the Lake District. We had been for a meal and was on the way back to the Airbnb. I had had a parcel strategically delivered to a supermarket, so I went in first. Then my boyfriend went in to buy beer and some groceries whilst I waited outside with the dog. It was dark and as it's off season, there weren't many people around. About 5 minutes into waiting on the pavement, an early 40-year-old man wearing a red shell suit type ensemble walked past. I accidentally caught eye contact, so smiled weakly and he leered creepily back as he passed. I watched him walk away, and as he got to the end of the shop he started screaming victims. Victims. Everyone's a victim. About 10 to 20 seconds after that he started singing Take Me Down to the Paradise City where the grass is green and the girls are pretty. He went round the corner and I thought it was safe. My boyfriend was taking too long at this point, so I tried to get his attention through the glass door. I then see the same guy coming back up the road heading straight towards me. I really didn't want to have another run-in with this guy, so I went into the supermarket, completely ignoring the no dogs allowed rule, and made an animated display so that both he and the cashier knew I was there. When my boyfriend came out, I explained what had happened and pointed out the guy who was staggering uphill the direction we needed to go. I suggested we hang back and kept our distance. He turned off down a side road and that was the last we saw of him. For the entire walk back, I was turning around to make sure we weren't being followed. Even now, as we're sat watching Die Hard, I'm really creeped out. I know I was probably in no danger, but it's a really weird thing to shout at a lone woman with a little dog. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. This happened around 2018, right after my sister moved out of our apartment together. It's been bothering me since I just moved out. I was home alone on my day off when someone knocked on my door. No one ever visits and I have anxiety, so that was terrifying to my brain already. I answered and it was a woman who lived in one of the basement apartments. She seemed nice at first, asking if I wanted any clothes she was giving away because they were her style but supposedly matched mine perfectly as a young woman. That was already a red flag in my mind because the only time I ever saw her was when I was walking to work, wearing my uniform of a black shirt, black pants, and black hat, but I let her talk because I'm super awkward and hated being rude to technical strangers. Then she started getting pushy and listing off super expensive name brands to try to get me to go to her apartment, which is an old small building, no cameras, and I lived on the top floor, which would be down what I call the creepy stairs and next to the door to the back lot no one used. Then I realized she was holding a notebook open with a script of what to say. I continued to project, but my anxiety wouldn't let me close the door on her face without fear of her lashing out. She kept insisting until I finally told her my boyfriend was going to be home soon and suggested she donated them. My boyfriend wasn't going to be home for many hours, but she didn't need to know that obviously. She leaves and I go back to my room, which has a window facing that back lot / alley. A few moments later, I hear a fight happening in the lot and see her with the previous. He was already fired at that point, maintenance man. It's a loud, screaming fight, and they're standing next to his truck, which has tinted windows and a covered truck bed. My paranoia went a little wild, so I texted my family about it to feel a bit safer. Then I believe he left, but a little while later, something hits my door hard. I didn't check, just stared. Then it happened again and again, all night until my boyfriend came home, and for a few days when I was alone. I found out after looking at the door that they were hitting my deadbolt and it was off center. Even after it was replaced, the damage couldn't be fixed. It stopped after a little while and the woman moved out almost immediately after all of that. I don't want to feed my paranoia, but something obviously wasn't right. I know I should have called the police, but police in my town are relatively useless. Also, that maintenance man was rehired and was the one who replaced my deadbolt, insisting he kept the extra key despite never needing the old. My new house is much safer, thankfully. This is a creepy encounter that started a couple months ago and stretches to now. I live in a condo building that shares a courtyard with a sister building. One evening just before sunset, I was sitting on a bench in the courtyard that has a view into my low-level apartment, listening to music and playing Sudoku on my phone. A man walking his dog approached me. He appeared to be in his late 50s or early 60s. I am a woman in my middle 20s, but did not find it that odd because his dog seemed interested in me. Without taking out my earbuds, I pet his dog, but then after a quick pet, the man was still hovering. I took out my earbuds, giving him a look of what's up. He nodded at my open purse that was beside me, which had a pack of cigarettes in it. Side note, I rarely smoke, they were in my purse left over from a bachelorette party. He asked for a cigarette, and I gave him one. He took that as an invitation to sit down next to me to smoke it. He started up small talk, asking if I lived there, how long I've lived there, stuff like that. After he finished the cigarette, I expected him to leave, but he stayed. I did not have any interest in spending my evening chatting with this guy, but I did not feel unsafe. Other people were walking their dogs and we were in view of many condo windows. I figured he was a lowly older man and it would be an easy kind deed to sit and chat with him on my Tuesday night. It got a little weird when he asked me if I'd like to come up to his apartment to try some fancy wine. He told me about how he's very into wine and his cigarette on his balcony. I told him I couldn't that night. He then asked me to text him as a way to exchange numbers because he didn't have his phone and that we could do it another time. I obliged to avoid the awkwardness of saying no. By now, it had been over an hour, it had gotten dark, and no one else was in the courtyards. He said it was nice talking. He looked forward to showing me the fancy wines, said he'd let me go enjoy the rest of my night, and he left. Shortly after, he texted me asking to plan for that Thursday night. I still assumed it was innocent and he was just lonely because the age difference. None of the conversation was flirty, and frankly I am a lot better looking than him age aside. That said, I didn't want to, so I strategically told him maybe due to tentative plans. This avoided the suggestion of an alternative date and gave me the easy opportunity to cancel. I shrugged it off as an interesting encounter and texted my friends about it. They all immediately told me it was very creepy and to cancel and not text him again. While I did not intend to go over there or text him again, I thought they were overreacting. Then I thought more about our innocent conversation and all the personal information he got out of me. He now knows which of the two buildings I live in. I didn't tell him which unit, but he could figure it out based on what he does know. The floor I live on, my unit faces the courtyard. My unit does not have a balcony, it's a rental, not an own unit, the month I moved in, and my cat likes to watch the courtyard from the window. He also now knows I live alone, my age, where I work, my past few employers, the suburb I grew up in, where I went to school, both high school and college, where my parents live, and my phone number. I didn't think I was stupid, but now I'm surprised I didn't give this guy my social security number. That said, he got this information out of me because he also shared all these details about himself. That, along with him living in the sister building, not mine, made me feel better. But then I remembered the sister building's fobs work to access each other. I also then remembered he told me multiple times he does not carry his phone or wallet on him while he walks his dog at night because of all the muggings. When he kept bringing this up, I found it very odd because we live in one of the safest neighborhoods of the city, but shrugged it off. I now am scared he may have bad intentions and wanted to persuade me into putting myself in a vulnerable position without my phone. I tried reverse searching his number and nothing came up. I was smart enough to read his last name from his dog's collar, and I googled it with the first name he gave me. But even with all the other information he gave me, like his job and education, I could not find him online. This left me a little unnerved, but his response to me canceling was just to text him another time when I am available. I felt better about it until the next Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week down to the hour of us originally meeting. I looked out my window and saw him sitting on the exact bench we were on, one of like 20, staring up at my building. He wasn't even with his dog or smoking, just sitting there looking up at my building. I immediately dropped to the floor and peeped only my head to take another look out the window, which starts a couple feet above the floor but stretches the whole wall horizontally. It was definitely him, and it made me feel sick to my stomach. I still excused it as maybe innocent, maybe he hoped to run it to me again and was just waiting, not spying. But in the weeks following, I saw him on that bench multiple more times. I've been avoiding the courtyard and keeping my blinds closed, but they can't be closed 24/7. Apart from me, both my cat and plants need the natural light. A couple weeks ago, my blinds were open and I had to pass the window naked to retrieve a towel. As I passed, I looked out the window. Not only was he on that bench, without his dog or a cigarette, looking up at my building, he was looking straight at my unit and my window at me. I again dropped to the floor. I grabbed the blanket next to me, wrapped myself in it, and stood back up. He was still staring. We held eye contact and he did not look away. Eventually, I closed the blinds, but he knew I knew and he was not shy about it. A few days after that, I saw him in my building lobby. I ignored him and he ignored me, and I quickly got into the elevator. I then left for a 2-week vacation. I got back a few days ago and haven't seen him. I'm hoping the time gap bored him. In the early 2000s, I was skateboarding outside of my old elementary school with a close friend. We were 12 or 13 at the time, and skateboarding can be a draw for police, and we were well aware of that. Being harassed by a running from cops was nearly a weekly occurrence for us around that time. After we had been there maybe 20 minutes, a new-looking unmarked Ford Ranger or maybe Mazda equivalent drove by, slowed down, and turned into the parking lot after noticing us. He got out and asserted he was a police officer and that we could get in a lot of trouble. He was wearing plain clothes, white, and probably in his 30s or 40s. He approached me, patted me down, obviously noticed something in my cargo pocket. It was a weed pipe. I was scared that I was going to get busted and I froze. He ignored the item in my pocket, along with whatever else was in there. I don't remember if the touches were weird in nature or focused on any one area of my body. He didn't bother searching my friend. He didn't ask any questions that I remember other than whether or not our parents knew we were there. I don't remember what we answered. Knowing us and our parents, they probably did have at least a vague idea of what we were up to. It is likely we said yes, but I seem to remember telling him no. He began to conclude the interaction and said something like be safe or you should probably go home now. Anyway, he got back in his truck. I remember seeing the cab after he opened the door and it looking like a mess inside. There was trash and signs that he was not driving an official vehicle of any capacity. I do remember thinking that was odd at the time. He left. We went on our merry way after I landed that kickflip down the 3-stair or whatever trick I was working on that day. The situation felt a little odd, but I didn't tell my parents. I was a teenager with more angst than most, after all. Plus, bringing it up would have surely invoked some lecture or accusation regarding drug use, and I was not about to bring that upon myself. Years later, my friend brought it up. He said he had mentioned it to his dad recently. His dad was a police officer at the time of the incident. His dad got upset and was dumbfounded by the fact that neither one of us told anyone about it. Now that I'm knocking some of this loose, I think my buddy actually told the guy his dad was a cop, and that is when he began disengaging. That was the day I realized that if I had been alone, things could have gone much worse. It was over 20 years ago, but I still wonder if I should report it in case it could lead to some sort of resolution for someone who was not as fortunate as we were. This happened about a week ago, so I had biked to school with my best friend. We were going to stay after school to work on a project together anyway, so it worked out. On our bike ride home from school, we decided not to go straight home and that we wanted to go on a small bike ride down a path by the park that will lead us back to my house anyways. When we were unchaining our bikes from the bike racks, I noticed like a red Dodge Dakota across from the school. Just for your information, we live in a pretty small town, so most of the kids who get picked up, we know of what cars they get into and what cars hang around the school at pickup time, as well as what cars the teachers and students own that drive themselves to school, or at least somewhat of an idea, but I usually didn't see that one, and it was probably like an hour and a half past the time school got out, but it could have been someone's relative picking them up, or whatever, so I really didn't think much of that. We started biking towards our path, and after about 5 minutes my friend told me the red truck was driving on the road next to the sidewalk we were biking on, but it was a little behind us. I told her that it's probably fine and a coincidence, and that they are probably going home or live around here, so we kept going. But he didn't stop. After about 10 more minutes of him still following us, then I started getting a little concerned. We ended up continuing until we got to a gas station, because then at least there would be people around and less of a chance of something happening. So we parked our bikes and went in. We grabbed drinks and a snack to not make it look odd that we were in there, but while we were in there I called my brother to come get us and that there was someone following us. He told us he would be right there and to just stay inside. So we did. We paid for our snacks and told the cashier about it, and she let us just sit there until my brother came. My brother pulled in, and so we walked out to get our bikes, but we couldn't find them. We looked around and saw the red truck pull behind the gas station with our bikes right next to it. The man that was driving it was looking right at us. We went and told my brother. He said forget about the bikes and get in the car. So we did. My brother got out of the car and went into the gas station to get the employee, and while he was doing that the man sped off out the back parking lot of the gas station. When my brother came out, he said that the gas station worker was going to check back the cameras and see if she can get a license plate to give to the police, and that my brother gave her our mom's information for any updates. We both made it home safe. I'll keep y'all updated when we find out more. I'm not sure how creepy this actually is, but I always try and play it safe. I don't believe in taking chances, and I don't intend on becoming another statistic. If that means playing on the side of caution, then so be it. I'm a bartender by trade. I've been working in bars since I was 21. I'm 29 currently and female, so I've had to pick a thing or two up. I get a fair amount of unwanted attention in my day-to-day life. I'd say about as much as the average woman gets. I'm not a vain person, but I do put a lot of attention into my wardrobe, my makeup, and my nails. I know it's such a sideways way of thinking, but most of my money is made on tips, and I have to make myself presentable enough. But because of this, I do set my boundaries very strongly. This doesn't mean that I'm perfect though. I'm still a person with people urges. It was a typical Saturday night. The bar that I currently work at, and the one I've been working at for the past 2 years, is a pretty small bar with more of an emphasis on the quality of the drinks and the relaxed atmosphere. I don't serve as many Vegas bombs or Bud Lights that I have at previous bars that I've worked at. It's mostly cocktails and craft beers. This usually keeps the rowdy crowd out. On Saturdays we do trivia night, which I occasionally get tasked with hosting. It's not my favorite thing to do, but something I have to do as per my job description. There was a girl in the crowd that was answering most of the questions I sent out. She wasn't alone and came in with a group of people, all seemingly in their middle 20s. Her and I ended up talking for a while at the bar in between serving drinks. She was flirty, which isn't something I'm incredibly good at, but she was sweet. And just to make it clear, I have an equal preference in men and women. I wasn't trying to lead her on or humor her for the sake of making tips. In the crowd of trivia participants came this one guy. I wasn't the one to identify him, so I couldn't tell you his name. He began making rude remarks from one bar stool down from where this girl was sitting. He was somewhere in his 30s. It seemed like he was hitting on her, but she didn't seem very responsive. I told him that she didn't seem interested and then he should stop. He apologized with a very sinister looking smile and looked down at my chest, claiming he was looking for a name tag to formally address me. We don't have name tags. I told him that if he continued making people uncomfortable, he would be removed. One thing I took notice of that made me sufficiently uncomfortable was the fact that he kept one hand in a jacket pocket, just the one, and he seemed to be fiddling with something. I don't play around with this kind of stuff, so I told security about it. While I was walking back, I overheard him telling another bar patron that I basically told him I would sleep with him when I got off of shift. The girl from the bar, as well as the random bargoer, told him that his behavior was out of line. I told him that he needed to leave and that security was going to kick him out. His response changed from sinisterly playful to outright agitated. He made a comment about my sexuality and told the random bar guy he was sitting near that he was a homophobic slur. I hate guys like this with a passion, people who want to disrupt the comfort of others in some half-hearted attempt at getting laid. I walked from behind the bar and told him to leave and tried again to flag security. He made a very crude comment about me letting him do some stuff to me, and in return I wouldn't feel the need to be attracted to women unless it was a, let's just say, group effort. The girl that I had been talking to threw a glass of scotch in his face, then headbutted him in the mouth. Security finally came running, only to try and kick her out. I flew into a rage over that and told him that the girl was good and she was only doing the job that he was supposed to be doing. He was removed from the bar. I kept an eye on him through the window. He stuck around near the bar for a bit, but after an hour or so he left. The girl offered to stay with me until closing, which wasn't necessary. I'd closed the place down so many times at 2 to 3 in the morning, but I gave her the "oh, would you please" for Italian. I also give credit where it's due, so I gave the other guy from the bar a good thank you hug before he left and told him that he made me feel safer. The girl told him the same, and I told the manager and the owner that we had an issue with the customer. Bar camera footage was pulled and his identity was confirmed. He had an issue with getting banned from bars and had a tendency to start fights while intoxicated. I hate to say it, but I'm still keeping an eye out for him. Not sure if this is creepy enough, but it was for me. My girlfriend and I were graduate students living together in a 6-unit apartment building with an outside stairwell. It was an older Victorian home that had been converted into apartments. The whole street was lined with similar buildings. It was off campus but conveniently located within walking distance of bars, a coffee shop, and several restaurants. The neighborhood had a laid-back, bohemian vibe. The tenants were a mixture of college kids, young professionals, and families. The area was generally safe, but it wasn't too far from a rougher section of town. It was a Thursday night, and being the night owl that I am, it was past 3 in the morning. I had just finished a movie. I turned the television off and went to the stairwell for a quick smoke before bed. We were in the middle of a snowstorm and the ground was covered in 6 inches of fresh powder and it was freezing scary cold. I quickly smoked my cigarette and rushed back inside. My girlfriend was always complaining about me forgetting to lock the door, and as was my habit, I left the door unlocked. I jumped into bed, and just as I was falling asleep, I thought I heard a noise. I brushed it off at first, but then I heard a creak, probably just the wind, I concluded. Moments later, I heard the floorboards creaking. Now I was listening intently. My girlfriend felt me shuffling and asked what was wrong. I told her I thought I heard something. Then we both heard what sounded like someone stumbling into our couch. We shot up, and I yelled, "Is someone there?" No answer. The floor creaked again. This time, in unison, we shouted, "Who's there?" Another noise. I quietly stood up and scanned the room for something that could be used as a weapon. Nothing. Growing up, my dad always kept a baseball bat under his bed, and I regretted not adopting this practice. We yelled again, but there was no response. Again, but this time, from the darkness, we were greeted by a low-pitched, incomprehensible growl. I wondered if one of my buddies was playing a prank on me. That seemed out of character for my friends, especially at this hour on a weekday night and during a snowstorm. What I really thought was that a crackhead had wandered in. My girlfriend yelled, "Who's out there?" More footsteps. The intruder was still in the family room, but he was getting closer to our bedroom. We heard the growl again, but this time it was followed by a gurgle, and it's Matt. We didn't know anybody named Matt, at least not any that would enter our apartment uninvited in the middle of the night. I looked at my girlfriend. I'd never seen someone so scared. If worst came to worst, I thought to myself, I know I can outrun this person. I hoped it didn't come to that. "Matt who?" We shouted repeatedly. After a long pause, he finally said, "Matt, I'm friends with Mike and Kelly." Relief washed over both of us. Mike and Kelly were our neighbors. I turned on the lights and walked into the family room. There he stood, a 6'2", slovenly looking college kid. Matt was blacked out drunk. Our neighbors had hosted a pre-game party at their apartment, followed by a trip to the nearby bars. They had abandoned Matt, and despite the storm, he had found his way back to their apartment. Their door was locked, and his phone calls had gone unanswered. His evolutionary drive to survive had kicked in, and he had sought warmth in the first unlocked apartment he could find. I told him that he scared us and that he had to go. He stepped outside, and I quickly locked the door behind him. The next day, I learned that Matt froze to death. He'd been discovered by another neighbor, huddled next to her car under the lean-to garage. I'm just kidding. I have no idea what happened to Matt. I do, however, remember being a little concerned for him after my nerves settled. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.